Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It started as an ordinary drive, a late-night trip down a deserted highway, headlights cutting through the darkness as the familiar hum of my car echoed around me. The road stretched out like a black ribbon ahead, endless and empty, with nothing but the faint glow of stars above. I wasn't in a hurry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt too thick, the silence too deep, and my heartbeat, well, it was a little faster than usual. I've done plenty of night drives before. I actually kind of like them. There's a certain peace in the stillness, just me and the open road, the world asleep around me. But that night, something felt different, like the calm before a storm. It was around midnight when I noticed the car behind me. At first, it was nothing unusual, just another set of headlights in my rearview mirror, maybe 100 yards back, moving at the same speed as me. But after a few miles, I realized something strange. The car hadn't passed me, hadn't even tried to. No matter how long the road stretched out ahead of us, it stayed right there, tailing me at a careful distance. Close enough to make me aware of it, but not so close that it felt aggressive. I shrugged it off at first, figuring maybe they were going the same way. After all, it was just a random car. But the farther we went, the more uneasy I became. I tried speeding up, just a little, to see if they would pass. They didn't. I slowed down, thinking maybe they'd go around me. Nothing. They just kept the same pace, matching my every move. A knot of anxiety formed in my stomach, and I turned up the radio, hoping some background noise would distract me. It didn't. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on the road ahead. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. It was late, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But that car, it was like a shadow, lurking just far enough behind to make its presence known, yet keeping its intentions hidden. About 20 miles down the road, I passed a sign for a rest stop. Without thinking twice, I flicked on my turn signal and pulled off the highway, hoping to shake the car off my tail. The moment I turned onto the ramp, I glanced into the mirror again, half expecting to see them zoom past me on the highway. But they didn't. Instead, they followed me onto the exit. My pulse quickened. This was getting weird. Too weird. I told myself they were probably just stopping for gas or a quick bathroom break, but the pit in my stomach grew heavier. The rest stop was dimly lit and eerily quiet, just a few flickering streetlights illuminating a handful of empty parking spaces. I pulled into a spot near the entrance and cut the engine, trying to act natural as I glanced in my rearview mirror again. The car parked 2 spaces over. It didn't make sense. Why park so close when there were plenty of open spots? My fingers hovered over the ignition for a second, and I thought about driving off, but something stopped me. Maybe I was just being ridiculous, overthinking things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got out of the car, pretending to stretch my legs, and casually glanced over at the vehicle. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't make out the driver. My heart thudded in my chest as I quickly made my way toward the rest stop's small convenience store, telling myself I just needed a bottle of water, maybe a snack, something to calm my nerves. Inside, the store was as empty as the parking lot. A bored-looking clerk sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone, barely glancing up as I entered. I wandered the aisles, my mind racing, trying to act like I wasn't freaking out. After grabbing a bottle of water, I went to the register. That's when I noticed the car through the store's front window. It hadn't moved. The engine was still running, headlights on, casting long shadows across the lot. Whoever was inside wasn't coming out. "Busy night?" I asked the clerk, trying to sound casual as I handed him a $5 bill. He looked up, then shrugged. "Not really, just you." I glanced outside again, feeling my stomach twist. "You ever notice people hanging around here late at night?" The clerk raised an eyebrow, following my gaze to the car. Sometimes, weird stuff happens on the highway, you know? His words didn't help. I grabbed my change and hurried out of the store, hoping I'd find the car gone by the time I got back to mine. But no, it was still there. And as I walked across the lot, I saw it. The driver's side door cracked open, just slightly. My breath hitched as I quickened my pace, fumbling for my keys. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and slid inside, locking the doors with shaky fingers. My hands were slick with sweat as I started the engine, but my eyes kept darting to the other car. Whoever was inside hadn't stepped out, but I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were waiting for something, or someone. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the lot, tires screeching as I merged back onto the highway. My heart was racing, and I told myself I was in the clear. Whatever that had been, it was over. But as I checked my rearview mirror, I saw them again, those same headlights. They were following me. Again. This time, they were closer. Panic surged through me. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, but the other car stayed right behind me, its headlights growing brighter in my mirrors. I tried to shake them by weaving through the lanes, taking random exits, but no matter where I went, they followed. At one point, I slowed down just enough to let them pass, hoping to catch a glimpse of the driver. But instead of speeding past, the car pulled up alongside me, keeping pace for a few terrifying seconds. My eyes flicked over, and in the dim light, I saw a silhouette behind the wheel, a shadowy figure, their face obscured, staring straight ahead. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I accelerated again, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. For a moment, the car fell back, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd lost them. But then they sped up again, closing the gap. I had no idea what they wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. My only goal was to get somewhere, anywhere, where there were more people, somewhere safe. After what felt like an eternity of driving with the car still in pursuit, I finally spotted the glow of a gas station ahead, its bright lights spilling out onto the dark highway. I veered off the road and pulled into the lot, my heart hammering in my chest. I half expected the car to follow me in, but to my relief, it didn't. Instead, it sped past, its taillights fading into the distance as it disappeared down the road. I sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The gas station attendant gave me a curious glance from behind the counter, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough. Eventually, I pulled myself together and continued my drive. The rest of the night passed in a blur, my nerves still on edge, but the car never returned. To this day, I have no idea who was following me or why. Maybe it was some prank, or maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, that drive left me with an unsettling truth. Even on the most familiar roads, you never really know who's watching. I'll never forget that eerie evening. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of purple and orange, but out on the farm, the light was already fading fast. Dusk settles in quickly when you're surrounded by open fields and nothing but trees in the distance. That's when everything feels a little too still, a little too quiet. I had been working on the tractor all afternoon, trying to get the old thing running smoothly again. It wasn't unusual for me to stay out late fixing equipment, but there was something about the air that evening. It was heavy, almost suffocating, like the calm before a storm. And I wasn't alone in noticing it. The cows were acting up, pacing around the edges of the pasture with their heads lowered, snorting and huffing. They're usually docile, so seeing them that agitated put me on edge. I told myself they were just restless, maybe spooked by a coyote or some other animal that had wandered too close. But deep down, I had this uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I stood up from under the hood of the tractor, wiping the grease off my hands onto a rag. That's when I first saw it, or rather, them. At the far edge of my property, right where the field meets the thick line of trees, I noticed a figure standing there. It was hard to tell who it was from that distance, but they weren't moving, just standing perfectly still, like a statue, facing my direction. I squinted, thinking maybe it was one of my neighbors, but something about their posture was off. The way they were standing, almost too rigid, didn't feel natural. I glanced around, looking for any sign of another person or a vehicle that might have brought them here. But there was nothing. Just that figure, and the growing shadows as the light faded. My first instinct was to shout, ask if they needed help. But the words stuck in my throat. Something told me not to. Instead, I stared, trying to make sense of it. As I stood there, frozen in place, I felt that strange heaviness in the air deepen. The cows were now huddled together near the fence, their snorts turning into low, anxious moos. That was when the figure moved. It wasn't a casual walk or even a turn. No, it was a sudden jerk, like someone yanking a puppet by the strings. They shifted just a step closer, and even though it was just a small movement, it made my skin crawl. Every alarm bell in my body went off at once. I backed up, trying to keep my eyes on them while making my way toward the barn. If this was some prank, it was a damn good one. I wasn't about to let some stranger sneak up on me in the middle of my own field. By the time I reached the barn door, the figure had taken another step forward, and then another. But they weren't walking like a normal person would. It was more like they were gliding. With each step, they got closer. But their movements were so stiff, like their legs weren't bending. My hands fumbled for the latch on the barn door, my breath coming quicker as I yanked it open and slipped inside. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, listening for any sound outside. The barn was quiet, the only noise being the shuffling of the animals inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That figure was still out there. I knew it. Peering through a crack in the door, I scanned the field. At first, I didn't see anything, and I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they had left, given up on whatever game they were playing. But then, I spotted movement again. Only this time, there wasn't just one figure. There were three. My stomach dropped. All three stood in the same place, near the tree line, their heads tilted slightly in unison, like they were watching me. None of them moved, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I wasn't sure if they could see me peeking through the barn door, but I didn't want to find out. I stepped back, my heart racing in my chest. What the hell was going on? This wasn't normal. I'd lived out here for years and never seen anything like this. No one would be stupid enough to play a joke like this in the middle of nowhere. And besides, something about the way they stood, the unnatural stillness, wasn't human. I needed to get inside the house. The barn felt too open, too exposed. But between me and the safety of my home was a whole lot of empty field, and I'd have to cross right in front of those figures to make it there. For a moment, I considered calling someone, my neighbor, maybe, or even the police. But when I reached for my phone, but it wasn't in my pocket, I must have left it on the tractor. My pulse quickened as I tried to think of a plan. I couldn't just sit there in the barn all night. I had to get inside, lock the doors, and figure out what the hell was happening. Taking a deep breath, I decided to make a run for it. If they were just standing there, maybe they wouldn't follow. I peeked through the crack again. The figures hadn't moved. They were still standing, heads tilted slightly, staring in my direction. On the count of 3, I threw the barn door open and sprinted toward the house, my boots pounding against the dirt. I didn't dare look back. The whole time, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, or worse, see one of them suddenly appear in front of me. But there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing, ragged and panicked, and the distant mooing of the cows. I reached the porch, nearly tripping over the steps in my rush to get inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and backed away, trying to catch my breath. I glanced out the window, hoping, praying, that the figures were gone, but they weren't. They were closer now, standing just at the edge of the field, their outlines barely visible in the fading light. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them, their heads still tilted, their bodies motionless. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The air was thick with tension, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then, one of them moved. Not toward me. No, it just lifted its arm, slowly, and pointed right at me. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't anything I could explain. I didn't know who or what those figures were, but they weren't human. I could feel it in my bones. I turned away from the window and grabbed the phone off the kitchen counter, my fingers trembling as I dialed my neighbor's number. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. I tried again. Still nothing. Panic set in. I felt trapped, like the walls of the house were closing in on me. I couldn't stay here, not with those things outside. But I didn't know where to go, and I sure as hell didn't want to step back outside. For the next hour, I paced around the house, checking the windows every few minutes. The figures never came any closer, but they didn't leave either. They just stood there, watching, waiting. Eventually, the sky grew darker, and the field was swallowed up by the night. I could no longer see the figures, but I knew they were still out there. I could feel them. I stayed up all night, too afraid to sleep, my eyes glued to the window. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke over the horizon, I breathed a sigh of relief. The figures were gone. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, and I can't help but wonder, what were they? What did they want? And most importantly, will they come back? There's something about road trips that I've always loved. The freedom of the open road, the promise of adventure, and the feeling that anything could happen. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, a long drive across the country, stopping wherever the mood struck us. No real itinerary, just a loose plan to hit a few landmarks along the way. It was supposed to be the kind of trip where you made memories, not necessarily kept to a schedule. But looking back, I wish we had been a little more rigid with our plans that day. It was our third day on the road, cruising through the flat plains of the Midwest. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow across the horizon, and we were all in high spirits. We had the music turned up, snacks scattered across the back seat, and no worries in the world. That was until Jason, who was driving, suggested we take a detour. "There's this old scenic road up ahead," he said, glancing over his shoulder at us in the back seat. "We'll get to see some old towns, maybe even find a cool spot to camp for the night." I wasn't sure about the idea. The GPS had us on a major highway, a straight shot to the next town where we had planned to grab dinner and find a motel. But Jason was adamant about getting off the beaten path, and everyone else seemed to think it would be fun. So, against my better judgment, we agreed. That was our first mistake. The moment we turned off the highway onto that narrow two-lane road, something shifted. The pavement was cracked and uneven, lined with thick trees that seemed to lean in as if watching us pass. The sunlight filtered through the branches in long, eerie shafts, and the air felt heavier, like the atmosphere had changed as soon as we left the highway. Still, no one said anything at first. We were too busy marveling at how isolated it felt, like we'd stumbled onto a forgotten road that no one had driven in years. About half an hour into the detour, I noticed the GPS had lost signal. The small blue dot that had been tracking us was now stuck in place, refusing to load. I mentioned it to Jason, but he just shrugged it off. "It's probably just the trees messing with the signal," he said. We'll hit an open area soon enough. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I let it go. The road kept winding through the trees, growing narrower with each mile. We hadn't seen another car since we'd turned off, and the farther we drove, the more the sense of isolation crept in. About an hour later, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and we were plunged into near darkness. The headlights of the car barely cut through the thick shadows of the trees, and the mood inside the car had shifted. The chatter had died down, and everyone was staring out the windows, looking for some sign of life, any sign of where we were. That's when we realized we had been driving in circles. "Wait, is that the same sign we passed an hour ago?" I asked, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. There, on the side of the road, was a rusted metal sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It looked familiar, too familiar. Jason slowed down, frowning. "No way. I've been following the road. We couldn't have looped back." But deep down, we all knew we had. Somehow, we were right back where we started. That creeping sense of unease settled in my chest like a weight, and I glanced at my phone again. Still no signal. We were completely cut off. "Maybe we should turn around," Sarah, my best friend, said from the back seat, her voice tight with worry. "This doesn't feel right." Jason hesitated, but nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right. We'll head back to the highway." He put the car in reverse, turned around, and started driving back the way we came. For the first few minutes, I felt a flicker of relief. We'd retrace our steps, get back on the highway, and laugh about how we'd gotten spooked for nothing. But as we drove, the road started to look different. The twists and turns were sharper, the trees denser, and the headlights seemed to barely penetrate the growing darkness. The road wasn't the same as when we had come in. That's when the panic started to set in. "I swear this isn't the same way we came," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. "Just keep driving," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We'll find our way back." But I could hear the doubt in her voice. We all felt it. The road kept twisting, stretching out farther into the night, and soon, the only sound in the car was the rhythmic hum of the tires on the cracked pavement. After what felt like hours, Jason slammed on the brakes. We skidded to a stop in the middle of the road, and I felt my heart jump into my throat. Up ahead, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights, was an old gas station. The sign out front flickered weakly, casting a pale light over the building, and a single rusty pump stood out front, covered in dust and cobwebs. "We'll stop and ask for directions," Jason said, though his voice didn't sound confident. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be inside, but the place looked abandoned, had probably been abandoned for years. Still, we had no other options. We pulled up next to the pump, and Jason got out. I watched as he walked toward the gas station's front door, peering inside the dark windows. The rest of us stayed in the car, our eyes glued to the empty road behind us. Minutes passed, and Jason didn't come back. "Where the hell is he?" Sarah muttered, her hands gripping the seat in front of her. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "Maybe no one's here." Before we could decide what to do, the front door of the gas station creaked open, and Jason stepped out, his face pale. He climbed back into the car, not saying a word. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's no one here," he said, staring straight ahead. "The place is completely empty, but—" He trailed off, his eyes wide. "But what?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward. "There's food inside. Fresh food, cans, snacks, even soda. But it looks like no one's touched the place in years. Like someone's been stocking it, but no one's around." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. None of it was right. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "We'll keep driving until we find the highway." Jason nodded, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. We pulled back onto the road, the gas station disappearing into the night behind us. But as we drove, the sense of dread only deepened. The road stretched on, winding through the dark forest like a snake, and every turn felt like it was leading us farther from civilization. Then, out of nowhere, we saw headlights in the distance. My heart leapt. Another car. Finally. We weren't alone out here, but as the car approached, something about it felt wrong. The lights were blinding, but there was no sound. No engine, no tires on the pavement. Nothing. Just the blinding headlights barreling toward us, faster and faster. Jason swerved to the side, pulling off the road just in time. The car sped past, its headlights disappearing into the distance as quickly as they had appeared. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I turned around to look back. There was no car, no taillights, nothing. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We were too shaken, too confused. We kept driving, the silence in the car thick with fear. Every mile felt like we were sinking deeper into something we didn't understand, something we couldn't escape. The road, the trees, the darkness, they all seemed to blur together, and soon I lost all sense of time. Eventually, we saw the sign for the highway again, but by then, none of us felt relieved. We had been driving in circles, sure, but this wasn't a normal detour. Something was wrong with that road, and we knew it. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, hours later, our nerves frayed and our hands shaking. When we finally pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, we sat there in silence, too stunned to even speak. None of us talked about what had happened that night. We didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to give it any more power than it already had. But I still think about it sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't found our way out? You ever get that strange feeling that something is wrong, even when everything around you seems perfectly normal? It's like a creeping sensation that starts in your stomach and makes its way up to your throat, a low hum of unease that you can't explain. That's what it felt like the first night aboard the cruise ship. It should have been the most relaxing vacation of my life. Just me and my husband, Tim, spending 10 days at sea, with nothing but blue skies and calm waters. But almost as soon as we set sail, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just little things. The way the air in the hallways felt stale, even though we were out in the open ocean. The strange flicker of the lights when we passed certain parts of the ship, the distant hum of machinery that never seemed to stop. And the passengers, most seemed perfectly fine, laughing and lounging by the pool. But there were a few who, well, let's just say their behavior didn't quite sit right with me. It was our second night aboard when things really started to get strange. Tim and I had just finished dinner in the main dining hall and were walking back to our cabin. The halls were quiet, except for the faint sound of music drifting from the ballroom, where some kind of formal event was going on. Tim was making jokes about how we should crash it, but my mind was elsewhere. Something was bothering me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. That's when I first noticed her. An older woman, maybe in her late 70s, sitting alone at a small table near one of the windows, staring out at the dark ocean. She wasn't dressed for dinner like everyone else, just a plain, old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd wear to a casual gathering. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes looked distant, like she wasn't really there with the rest of us. I nudged Tim and nodded toward her. "Do you see her?" He glanced over, shrugged. "Yeah, probably just a widow or something. Cruises attract all kinds, as you know." But something about her felt off. She didn't move, didn't react to anything around her. She just sat there, staring out at the water like she was waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling, even after we got back to our cabin. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the gentle creaks and groans of the ship as it moved through the water. Tim fell asleep right away, but I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. Why was she sitting there alone? Why hadn't she looked up when we passed? The next day, we decided to explore more of the ship. It was huge, almost like a floating city, with shops, restaurants, and even a small theater. We spent the day lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails, and soaking up the sun. By the time the evening rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about the woman. Almost. Later that night, we found ourselves in the same hallway as before, making our way back to the cabin after another late dinner. I glanced over at the spot by the window, half expecting the woman to be gone, but she wasn't. She was still sitting there, in the same exact spot, staring out at the ocean like she hadn't moved in 24 hours. The same pale dress, the same distant look in her eyes. I stopped walking, my stomach turning with unease. Tim, she's there again? He followed my gaze and frowned. Weird? Think she's okay? I don't know. I felt a chill run down my spine. It's like she hasn't moved at all. Tim shifted uncomfortably. Maybe she's just lonely. Do you want to check on her? I hesitated, torn between my growing sense of dread and the nagging feeling that I should do something. Before I could make up my mind, a member of the ship's crew appeared from around the corner, walking briskly toward us. He was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, with a neat uniform and a polite smile plastered on his face. Is everything all right? He asked, looking between us. I pointed to the woman. We've seen her sitting there 2 nights in a row. She hasn't moved. Is she okay? The crew member's smile faltered for a split second, just enough for me to notice. He glanced over at the woman, then quickly turned back to us, his face composed again. Oh, I'm sure she's fine. Some passengers enjoy spending their time in the quiet areas of the ship. I wasn't convinced. She looks like she's been sitting there for a long time. The crew member's smile grew tighter. I'll make sure someone checks on her, but I wouldn't worry. Enjoy the rest of your evening. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Tim and me standing there, feeling more unsettled than before. I don't like this, I muttered as we continued down the hallway. Something's not right. Tim sighed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. You're probably overthinking it. Let's just get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the woman's blank stare, the crew member's strained smile. Something wasn't adding up. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I started asking around, casually bringing up the old woman in conversations with other passengers. Most of them hadn't noticed her, but one couple, a pair of retirees from Florida, seemed to know what I was talking about. Oh, you mean the lady in the window seat? The woman said, her face lighting up. We've seen her a few times. Strange, isn't it? She never seems to leave that spot. Do you know who she is? I asked, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. The couple exchanged a glance, and the man shrugged. We asked one of the crew members about her yesterday. He said there's no one registered on the ship that fits her description. I blinked. What? That's what he said, the woman added, her voice lowering as if she were sharing a secret. No one matching her age or appearance is on the passenger list, but we've seen her, just like you. So, who knows? That sent a chill through me. If she wasn't a registered passenger, then who was she? And why hadn't anyone from the crew seemed concerned? That night, I couldn't resist. After dinner, I dragged Tim back to the same spot by the window, and sure enough, she was there again, sitting in the same position, staring out at the dark waves. Okay, this is getting creepy, Tim muttered, glancing around as if hoping someone else would confirm what we were seeing. But the hallway was empty, just us and her. "Let's go," I whispered, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence around us. "This isn't right." We turned to leave, but just as we were about to step away, I heard something, a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the ship. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tim shook his head. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, I heard it again, soft, like a breath on the wind. "Help." I whipped around, my eyes locking on the woman. Her head hadn't moved, but her lips, they were moving, just barely. The same blank stare, the same pale face, but now, her mouth was forming words. "Help me." I grabbed Tim's arm, my whole body shaking. "She's saying something." He took a step back, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." We practically ran back to our cabin, slamming the door behind us. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. Who was she? Why was she asking for help? And why did the crew act like she didn't exist? The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the front desk and demanded to speak to someone in charge. After some back and forth, they finally agreed to send a senior crew member to meet with me. When he arrived, I explained everything. The woman, the strange behavior, the whispers. He listened patiently, nodding along, but when I finished, his expression was unreadable. "I understand your concern," he said, his voice calm, "but I assure you, there's no one on this ship fitting that description." I stared at him in disbelief. "But we've seen her, multiple times. Other passengers have seen her too." He didn't budge. "Sometimes, the mind can play tricks, especially in unfamiliar environments. I suggest you try to enjoy the rest of your trip." I left the meeting feeling more confused than ever. I knew what I'd seen. I knew she was real. But if no one would acknowledge her existence, what could I do? We disembarked a few days later, and I never saw the woman again. But even now, as I sit here recalling the events of that trip, I can't shake the feeling that I left something or someone behind. And I still wonder, what would have happened if I had listened to her plea for help? There's a certain kind of quiet you can only find in the deep woods. It's the kind that presses in on you, heavy and thick, where the usual sounds of life, birds, insects, the wind through the trees, fade into a silence that feels unnatural. That's the quiet I found myself in when I set up camp in a remote section of the national forest, miles from the nearest trail, completely alone, or at least, that's what I thought at first. I'd been on countless solo camping trips before. It's my way of unplugging, getting away from the constant noise of life, works, and people. I've always felt at home in the wilderness, just me, the trees, and the stars. This trip wasn't supposed to be any different. In fact, I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. The first day went as planned. I hiked in with my pack, found a perfect clearing to set up camp, and spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding area. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the forest felt alive. I even caught glimpses of deer and a family of rabbits near a stream that cut through the woods. It was exactly what I needed. By the time night fell, I had a fire going and my tent pitched, ready to settle in for a peaceful night under the stars. The silence didn't bother me, not at first. In fact, I welcomed it. There's something comforting about the steady crackle of a campfire and the deep darkness that you only find far away from any city lights. But as the hours passed and the fire began to die down, I started to notice something odd. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, had stopped. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone out here, completely disconnected from everything. Of course, Things would feel different in the stillness. But then, I heard it, a soft crunch just outside the ring of light from my dying fire. A footstep. I froze, my body tensing as my mind raced through the possibilities. It could be a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal curious about the campsite. But as I sat there, listening, I realized the footsteps weren't random. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was circling my camp. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. Another crunch, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively reached for the flashlight I had set next to me. Shining it into the darkness, I swept the beam across the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The light revealed only the dense line of trees, their shadows long and eerie in the flickering firelight. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. It had to be an animal. There was no one else out here. No one even knew I was here. I decided to throw a few more logs on the fire, hoping the bright flames would scare off whatever was lurking out there. As the fire roared back to life, the footsteps stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening, my body tense and alert. Nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of the wood. I stayed up for another hour, sitting close to the fire, listening intently for any other sounds. But the footsteps didn't return, and eventually, my eyelids grew heavy. I convinced myself it was just a curious animal, and after checking my surroundings one last time, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside seemed amplified in the stillness, and my mind kept replaying those footsteps, the way they had circled me in the dark. I lay there for what felt like hours, my senses on high alert, listening for any sign of movement. Sometime in the middle of the night, I finally drifted off. It couldn't have been long before I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps again, this time much closer. They weren't just outside the camp, they were right outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone or something was pacing around the tent. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the zipper of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who would be out here? I was miles from any trail, and I hadn't seen another person all day. The thought of some stranger wandering through the woods in the middle of the night, silently circling my tent, sent a cold shiver down my spine. The footsteps stopped. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my hand trembling, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I swept the light around the campsite, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was nothing there. No one. But I could feel it. I wasn't alone. I crawled out of the tent, standing cautiously by the fire, which had burned down to embers. The woods around me were still, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to pack up and get out of there as fast as I could. But where would I go? It was the middle of the night, and I was deep in the forest, far from any help. I decided to rebuild the fire, piling on as much wood as I could find, letting the flames grow high and bright. I didn't know if it would keep whatever was out there away, but the light made me feel safer, at least. For the next few hours, I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, scanning the trees. I never heard the footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Eventually, dawn broke, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. The sense of dread that had gripped me all night began to lift, and I finally allowed myself to relax a little. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the daylight brought with it a sense of safety. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, eager to get out of the woods and back to civilization. As I hiked back toward my car, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest was quiet again, and I saw no sign of anyone. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods, my car finally in sight, that I allowed myself to take a deep breath. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Part of me still wonders if I imagined it all, if the isolation of the woods played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I heard. Those footsteps weren't my imagination. Something or someone was out there watching me from the shadows. And the scariest part, I'll never know who or what it was. There's something about truck stops in the middle of the night that always feels a little off. The bright lights casting long shadows, the eerie quiet, and the sense that time itself has slowed down. I've been a trucker for over 10 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing, not even the countless empty highways or the fog-covered mountain passes, prepared me for what I experienced that night. I'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, and the exhaustion was hitting me hard. My eyes were heavy, my hands stiff on the steering wheel, and the endless stretch of road in front of me felt like it was never going to end. I knew I needed to stop, get some sleep, or at least a cup of coffee to keep me going until I reached my next drop-off. That's when I spotted it. A truck stop glowing like a beacon in the distance, its fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't on my usual route, but out in the middle of nowhere. You take what you can get. I signaled, eased off the highway, and pulled into the parking lot, my rig rumbling to a stop near the edge. As I stepped out of the cab, I was greeted by the crisp night air. But something about the place felt wrong. It was too quiet. Sure, there were a few other trucks parked here and there, their drivers likely asleep in their cabs, but there wasn't a single soul walking around. The gas pump stood abandoned, the convenience store dimly lit, but no movement inside. The only sound was the faint hum of my truck cooling down. I shook off the unease. I'd been on the road too long, that's all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I needed to stretch my legs, grab a coffee, and maybe catch an hour or two of sleep before I hit the road again. I headed toward the small convenience store, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as I stepped through the automatic doors. The place was empty, just as I expected, and the cold air inside hit me like a wall. There was a cashier behind the counter, but he didn't look up when I walked in. He was hunched over, his face hidden under a baseball cap, and his hands were clasped together on the counter like he was deep in thought. "Evening," I mumbled as I made my way to the coffee machine. No response. The coffee machine sputtered as it poured the last dregs into the cup. Great, lukewarm, stale coffee. I took a sip and grimaced. Still, it was better than nothing. I grabbed a pack of gum and a bottle of water from the shelf and headed back to the counter. The cashier didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge I was there. I placed the items down, waiting for him to ring them up, but the silence dragged on. "Hey, man," I said, my voice louder now, tinged with frustration. "You okay?" He finally moved. Slowly, his head tilted up just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes, there was something off about them. They were dull, almost lifeless, like he wasn't fully there. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a moment before his hands moved in a stiff, robotic motion, scanning my items. The uneasy feeling from earlier came rushing back, stronger now. I suddenly wanted to get out of there, get back to my truck, and put as much distance between me and this place as possible. I shoved a few bills onto the counter and grabbed my things, not even bothering to wait for my change. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound behind me, a low, distorted hum, almost like static. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the cashier fiddling with a radio or something. But he was just standing there, completely still, his hands resting on the counter, his head slightly tilted to one side. The static sound grew louder, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I hurried out of the store, my heart pounding, and made my way back to my truck. The parking lot felt even more deserted than before. the lights casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move as I walked. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I turned the engine on, hoping the familiar rumble would calm my nerves. It didn't. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The convenience store was still there, glowing under the harsh lights, but something caught my eye. Near the edge of the lot, just at the edge of the shadows, there was a figure standing there. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a person, just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. A chill ran down my spine. I pressed down on the gas, eager to get back on the road, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, until the store and the lot disappeared from my view entirely. I told myself I was overreacting. I was tired, running on fumes, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the miles ticked by, the feeling of dread didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The next few hours were a blur. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, the occasional sign whizzing past in the headlights. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that I wasn't alone. At some point, I decided to pull off to the side of the road to catch some sleep. I parked at a rest area, a small, quiet spot with a few benches and a vending machine. There were no other vehicles around, but that didn't surprise me. It was the middle of the night, after all. I turned off the engine, settled back in the driver's seat, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come. It started as a faint tapping, just a light, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the cab. I opened my eyes, my heart immediately speeding up. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, looking around, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the rest area silent. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the side of the truck. But the tapping continued, soft but deliberate, like someone was knocking on the door. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated for a moment before rolling down the window just a crack. I shined the light outside, sweeping it across the lot, the road, and the trees beyond. Nothing. I closed the window, my hands trembling, and locked the doors again, but the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the passenger side now, like someone or something was moving around the truck, knocking on the windows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I sat there, breathing hard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the faint hum of the engine as it cooled. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even move. I sat there in my seat, wide awake, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside and check the truck, there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything, having been near me at all. But as I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the passenger side window, smeared in the dust, was a single handprint. I never stopped at that truck stop again. In fact, I've gone out of my way to avoid that entire stretch of highway ever since. Whatever happened that night, whatever I heard, whatever was out there, I don't want to know. And the next time I'm driving late at night and feel that sense of unease creeping in, I'll listen to it. Because out on the open road, in the middle of nowhere, sometimes your instincts are all you've got. Growing up on a farm, you get used to the quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear the wind rustling through the crops, the occasional distant hum of a tractor, or the soft cluck of chickens in the distance. But there's a different kind of quiet that settles in just before something goes wrong. It's a silence that feels too thick, too still, like the land itself is holding its breath. That's what I felt the night something strange showed up in our cornfield. It was late October and the harvest was just about done. My dad had already brought in most of the corn, leaving only a few rows standing on the far side of the property. It was late, and the day had been long, but I like to take a walk around the fields before heading to bed, just to clear my head and listen to the night. That evening, the air was crisp, the sky clear, and the moon was full, casting a soft glow over the fields. It was perfect weather for a quiet walk, but as soon as I stepped off the porch, I could tell something was off. The usual sounds of the farm, the crickets, the distant call of an owl, were gone. It was dead silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the change in the weather. After all, autumn nights could be unpredictable. I made my way down the gravel path that cut through the fields, my boots crunching with each step. The rows of corn towered over me on either side, their dry leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The moonlight cast long shadows, making the stalks look like dark, swaying figures in the night. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The animals, the cows in the pasture, the chickens in the coop, were unusually restless. The cows were pacing, snorting and huffing, and the chickens were huddled together, quiet and alert. It was like they sensed something I couldn't. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the cornfield. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the wind, but it grew louder the closer I got to the edge of the field. I stopped, squinting into the darkness, trying to see what might be causing it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the way the sound moved, it wasn't natural. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My heart started to race, and I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. We'd had issues with wildlife getting into the crops before, so it wasn't out of the ordinary, but something about the sound felt different. It was too steady, too purposeful, like whatever was making it wasn't just wandering, it was walking. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped into the cornfield, pushing through the tall stalks as quietly as I could. The dry leaves scratched at my arms, and the rustling grew louder. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the sound seemed to move, like it was circling me, just out of sight. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the moonlight. A tall, slender figure, moving through the rows of corn, just ahead of me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a person, at least, not any person I'd ever seen. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and the way it moved, almost gliding between the stalks, was unnatural. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as it disappeared deeper into the field. My heart was pounding, and every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to go back to the house, to lock the doors and forget I'd ever seen it. But something, some twisted sense of curiosity, kept me moving forward. I followed the figure, careful to stay hidden in the shadows of the corn. The further I went, the more I realized I was heading toward the part of the field that hadn't been harvested yet. The tall stalks loomed over me, casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. I crouched down, holding my breath, listening. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was deafening. Whatever was out there, it had stopped moving. It was waiting. I slowly stood up, scanning the field, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The figure was gone. At least, I couldn't see it anymore. But I knew it was still there. I could feel it, the same way the animals had felt it. A cold dread settled over me, and I turned to leave, deciding I'd had enough. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. This time, it was closer, much closer. It was standing at the edge of the unharvested corn, partially hidden by the tall stalks. But I could see its outline, tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms that seemed to stretch down past its knees. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching me, studying me. I took a step back, my heart racing. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at this thing, whatever it was. Then, without warning, it took a step toward me. The corn around it rustled, and the sound of its movement was unmistakable, like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. I ran, crashing through the corn, not caring about the noise I was making. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the field, panting and out of breath. I turned around, half expecting to see the figure standing right behind me. But the field was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the corn. I didn't waste any time. I sprinted back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. I kept replaying the way it had moved, the way it had seemed to follow me, silently watching from the shadows. The next morning, I went back to the field. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe signs of an animal, tracks, or something that would explain what I had seen. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken stalks, no sign that anything had been out there at all. Except for one thing. In the middle of the field, right where I had seen the figure standing, there was a single, deep impression in the dirt. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly, but it was large, roughly the shape of a foot, with long, claw-like indentations at the front. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. Whatever had been out there the night before, it hadn't been a deer or a raccoon, and it certainly wasn't human. I don't walk through the fields at night anymore. In fact, I don't go out there after dark at all. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I was overtired, or that I'd let the silence of the night get to me. But deep down, I know that's not true. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong. And every time the wind rustles through the corn, I can't help but wonder if it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to get away. You ever see something so out of place that your brain tries to make sense of it in the most rational way possible? Like when you're driving late at night, and you spot something in the sky, and your first instinct is to tell yourself it's a plane, or maybe a distant tower. That's how it all started for me. Just a late night drive home, nothing unusual, until I saw those lights hovering above the field. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving back from a weekend trip with my girlfriend, Jess. We were on one of those long stretches of highway where the road seems to disappear into the dark, and there's not a single car for miles. It was just us, the road, and the stars. I remember the first time I saw the lights. They looked like they were pretty far off in the distance. They were faint, just barely noticeable above a field that stretched out to our right. At first, I thought it might have been a distant airplane or maybe the reflection of something from the ground. Jess hadn't noticed them yet, so I didn't say anything. We'd been driving for hours, and I figured I was just tired. But as the miles passed, the lights got brighter. They weren't blinking like plane lights, though, and they didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. Instead of traveling across the sky like you'd expect from a plane, they hovered, staying in one spot, then shifting positions suddenly in a way that didn't make any sense. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked Jess, trying to keep my voice casual, though my stomach was already doing somersaults. She looked up from her phone, squinting out the passenger window. "See what?" "Those lights," I said, nodding toward the field. "Right there." She leaned forward, frowning. "What the hell is that?" I was relieved she could see them too. At least I wasn't imagining things. The lights were brighter now, 3 or 4 of them, hovering in a tight cluster, almost like they were observing something. "Maybe it's some kind of drone," Jess suggested, though her voice was more uncertain than confident. I didn't respond. I was too focused on watching the lights as they suddenly split apart, moving in different directions before stopping again, completely still. There was something unsettling about the way they moved. Too fast, too smooth, not at all like anything I'd seen before. I pressed down on the gas, suddenly eager to put some distance between us and whatever was out there. Jess turned back to me, her eyes wide with concern. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's weird, right?" She nodded, chewing on her lip as she glanced back at the lights. "Yeah, really weird." We drove in silence for a few more minutes, both of us occasionally stealing glances at the lights. They didn't seem to be getting closer, but they weren't fading away either. It was like they were keeping pace with us, staying just out of reach but close enough to make their presence known. That's when the engine sputtered. I frowned, glancing at the dashboard. The lights flickered, the radio cut out for a second, and the car jerked, as if something had momentarily drained the power. My heart skipped a beat, and I eased off the gas, hoping it was just a fluke. But then it happened again. The car stuttered, the headlights dimmed, and the engine made a low, strained sound, like it was struggling to keep going. "What's happening?" Jess asked, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know," I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. I slowed the car to a crawl, scanning the road for a safe place to pull over. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty fields, with no buildings or streetlights in sight. The car lurched one final time before the engine cut out completely. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the fields. Jess and I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, both of us staring at the dashboard as if willing the car to start up again. But the engine was dead, and the headlights had dimmed to a soft glow before fading out entirely. "This can't be happening," Jess whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. She held it up, but her face dropped when she saw the screen. No signal. I checked my phone too, but it was the same. No bars, no way to call for help. My stomach twisted with unease, and I turned my attention back to the field. The lights were still there, hovering above the field like they were watching us. And now, without the car's engine humming or the radio playing, the silence around us felt oppressive. I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Jess shot me a panicked look. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to check the engine," I said, though part of me wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I popped the hood and leaned in, shining the flashlight from my phone over the engine. Everything looked fine. No smoke, no signs of overheating. But that didn't explain why the car had just died on us. Suddenly, Jess gasped from inside the car. "Oh my God, they're getting closer." I straightened up and turned toward the field. Sure enough, the lights were moving. Slowly, but unmistakably. They were drifting toward us, their glow brighter and more intense than before. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the hood shut and hurried back to the driver's side. "Get in," Jess urged, her voice shaking. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me, though I wasn't sure what good that would do. The lights were still advancing, closing the distance between us and the field. They weren't moving erratically anymore. Now, they were coming straight for us. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her eyes locked on the lights. I didn't have an answer. I tried turning the key in the ignition again, but the engine didn't make a sound. We were stuck. The lights drew closer, so close now that I could see the way they flickered and pulsed, casting long shadows over the field. The air around us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite explain, like static electricity right before a storm. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the lights stopped. They hovered there, maybe 50 yards from the car, glowing in eerie silence. Jess and I stared, frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. But for several long moments, nothing did. And then, slowly, one by one, the lights began to rise, higher and higher, until they were just faint points of light in the night sky, blending in with the stars. I sat there, my heart still racing, watching as the lights disappeared into the darkness. The air around us seemed to lighten, the heaviness lifting, and suddenly, the car's dashboard flickered back to life. The headlights came on, and the engine rumbled to life, as if nothing had ever been wrong in the first place. Jess and I exchanged a look of disbelief. "Drive," she whispered. "Please, just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into gear and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the road. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, where we pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Neither of us had an explanation for the lights. I wanted to believe it was just some kind of bizarre atmospheric phenomenon, maybe a trick of the light or a drone test gone wrong. But deep down, I knew it was something more than that, something I couldn't explain. To this day, I don't know what we saw out there on that stretch of road, but every time I drive that way now, I can't help but glance at the fields, half expecting to see those strange lights again. And every time I do, I remember the way they moved, how they seemed to follow us, how they watched. People always say national parks are places of beauty, peace, and nature's purest form. But no one ever tells you how easy it is to get lost in them. And not just physically lost, though that's bad enough, but lost in a way that makes you question everything you think you know about the world. That's exactly what happened to me and my friends when we decided to take a quick hike through one of the park's lesser-known trails. It was supposed to be an easy day trip, a fun little adventure before heading back to the campsite. But what we found out there in those woods was anything but fun. It was early autumn, and the trees were just starting to turn. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect blue, and the trail we picked was supposed to be an easy loop, one of those beginner-friendly paths that led you past a creek and through some scenic lookouts. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Chloe, and 2 other friends, Jake and Emma. We'd all been hiking before, and none of us were worried about getting lost or running into any trouble. After all, it was a marked trail, and the map made it seem straightforward. We started off in high spirits, laughing, taking pictures, and enjoying the day. The trail was quiet, with just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. At first, everything was perfect. We stopped by the creek to skip stones, climbed up to one of the lookouts to take in the view, and even joked about how we should have brought snacks because the hike wasn't challenging enough. But somewhere along the way, things started to feel off. I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but the forest seemed to grow denser. The trees, which had been spaced out and easy to walk through, suddenly felt like they were closing in on us. The trail markers, those little blazes on the trees that were supposed to guide us, became harder and harder to spot. It wasn't until we realized we hadn't seen one in a while that the unease really set in. "Are we still on the trail?" Jake asked, slowing down to scan the trees. His voice had lost its carefree edge, replaced by a note of uncertainty. Chloe, always the optimist, waved him off. "We've just got to keep going. The trail loops back eventually, right?" I glanced around, feeling that same uncertainty. The problem was, the woods all looked the same now, just a never-ending stretch of tall trees, thick underbrush, and shadows. I didn't want to admit it, but a pit of anxiety was growing in my stomach. We hadn't seen another hiker in hours, and the light was starting to fade. Emma, usually quiet and reserved, finally spoke up. "I think we missed a turn or something. Shouldn't we have seen that creek again by now?" "Yeah," I agreed, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "Maybe we should go back the way we came." Jake pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but we all knew what was coming. "No service," he said, shaking his head. "And this map app isn't loading." Of course it wasn't. We were too deep into the park, and none of us had thought to bring a physical map. Classic mistake, right? Chloe took charge, like she always did in situations like this. "Let's just keep moving forward. We'll hit the trail eventually. We all agreed, though none of us were feeling as confident as we had that morning. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. But there was something else too. Something more than just the fading light or the growing chill. The woods felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but it was like the forest was watching us. The birds had gone silent, and the usual sounds of wildlife had disappeared completely. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot, felt amplified, like it was coming from something just out of sight. More than once I glanced over my shoulder, sure I'd seen movement between the trees, but whenever I looked again, there was nothing. "We should stop and figure this out," Emma said, her voice tight with worry. "I don't like this." But Chloe kept moving forward. "We're fine, Em. We just need to find the trail again. It's got to be close." We trudged on for another hour, the light fading to a dusky orange. The deeper we went, the less familiar everything looked. It didn't help that the woods had started to feel unnatural. The trees were all the same height, standing eerily straight, with their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The air was so still it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then we found the other group. At first, I thought it was a joke, like one of those reality show pranks where another group of hikers shows up to mess with you. But as we got closer, it became clear that something was wrong. The group was standing in the middle of the trail, or at least what we thought was the trail, huddled together, their backs to us. There were 3 of them, dressed in hiking gear, but something about the way they stood so still and stiff gave me chills. "Hey," Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the silence. "You guys lost too?" No answer, not even a flinch. We stopped a few yards away, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was definitely wrong. Their stillness, the way they didn't even turn to acknowledge us, it wasn't normal. "Maybe they didn't hear you," Chloe suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I stepped forward, trying to get a better look. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quieter now. "We're kind of lost. Do you know where the trail picks back up?" Again, no response, no movement. It was like they were frozen in place, not even breathing. Emma grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Let's get out of here. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. Every instinct I had was screaming to leave, to put as much distance between us and those people as possible. I turned to go, but that's when it happened. One of the figures, the tallest one, slowly turned its head toward us. I'll never forget that moment. The way its head moved, the slow, jerking motion, as if it hadn't turned its neck in years. And the face, it wasn't right. It was too pale, too blank, with eyes that were just slightly too wide. And the way it stared at us, unblinking, like it was looking through us rather than at us, I can't explain it. But there was no life in those eyes. None. "Run," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, sprinting through the woods, dodging branches and leaping over roots, our hearts pounding in our chests. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We ran until we couldn't anymore, finally collapsing in a small clearing, gasping for breath. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were now bathed in the eerie glow of twilight. "What the hell was that?" Jake panted, his face pale and his hands shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but I don't think they were hikers." We sat there for a long moment, trying to collect ourselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but none of us had any answers. Eventually, we found our way back to the main trail, though I still don't know how. It was like the woods had shifted, like the forest itself had decided to let us go. We made it back to the campsite just as night fully fell, our legs sore and our minds racing. None of us talked much after that. The drive home was quiet, and we never really discussed what we'd seen in the woods. Maybe we didn't want to believe it had happened. Maybe we didn't want to think too hard about who or what those figures were. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those hikers standing so still in the woods, waiting for something. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and my girlfriend, Kate, spending a few nights in a secluded cabin in the woods. No phones, no emails, no stress. Just the two of us, away from the constant buzz of our daily lives. The drive up had been picturesque, winding roads through dense forests, the autumn leaves turning vibrant shades of red and orange. It was everything we'd hoped for. But from the moment we stepped into the cabin, something felt off. The place was charming enough, rustic but cozy, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. There was even an old guest book on the coffee table, a little extra touch that made the place feel even more quaint. I figured it'd be full of comments from previous guests about how much they enjoyed their stay, or maybe some tips about the best hiking trails in the area. After we unpacked, Kate plopped down on the couch and grabbed the guest book, flipping through the first few pages with a smile. "Look at this," she said, laughing as she read aloud. "Had a great time here. The view from the deck is amazing." I smiled, but something about the cabin was bothering me. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the way the thick woods pressed in around us, the silence almost too perfect. But I pushed the feeling aside. We were here to relax, and I didn't want to start the weekend off with any weird vibes. We spent the first night curled up by the fireplace, drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing. It was peaceful, exactly what we'd needed. But even as the flames crackled and the warmth filled the room, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. It was like the cabin was too quiet, like the woods outside were watching, waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up early and made some coffee while Kate slept in. The light streaming through the windows made the cabin look less intimidating, and for a while, I started to relax. I sat down on the couch with my mug, glancing at the guest book Kate had left open on the coffee table. I hadn't really paid much attention to it the night before, but now, with the early morning light spilling across the pages, I found myself curious. I flipped through the entries, most of them cheerful and positive. People had written about how much they loved the peace and quiet, how they spent their days hiking or sitting by the fire. But as I got further into the book, the tone of the entries started to change. At first, it was subtle. One entry mentioned hearing strange noises outside at night. Another talked about how they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though they brushed it off as just their imagination. I frowned, flipping through more pages. The entries became shorter, more frantic. Woke up to footsteps outside the cabin. No one there when I checked. Hear knocking at the windows. Too dark to see anything. This place feels wrong. We're leaving early. A cold chill ran down my spine as I read the last one. The handwriting was shaky, like the person had scribbled it in a hurry. Kate stirred in the bedroom, and I quickly closed the book, not wanting to alarm her. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was just a prank, someone trying to scare the next guest for a laugh. But the fear in those words, it felt too real. Kate came out of the bedroom, stretching and smiling. "Morning," she said, walking over to kiss me on the cheek. "What's up? You look weird." I forced a smile, shaking off the unease. "Nothing. Just woke up early. Ready for breakfast?" The rest of the day was uneventful. We hiked one of the nearby trails, took pictures of the leaves, and spent the afternoon sitting out on the deck, enjoying the view. The strange feeling from that morning had faded, and I almost forgot about the guest book entirely. But that night, everything changed. We'd gone to bed early, exhausted from the hike, and I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on the window. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just a branch or maybe an animal brushing up against the glass. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. "Did you hear that?" Kate whispered beside me, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," I breathed, sitting up in bed. "Stay here." I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slowly climbed out of bed, my pulse racing. The tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, like someone, or something, was testing the window, waiting for us to react. I crept toward the window, every muscle in my body tense. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should even look. Part of me didn't want to know what was out there, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly pulled back the curtain and shined the flashlight out into the night. There was nothing, just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. No sign of anyone or anything that could have been making the noise. I let out a shaky breath and turned back to Kate. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing out there." She didn't look convinced, but we both tried to go back to sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting for the sound to return. But the rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping, the strange entries in the guest book, it was all adding up to something I didn't want to acknowledge. After breakfast, I went back to the guest book, flipping to the last few entries, hoping to find some explanation, some reassurance that it was all just in my head. But what I found instead made my blood run cold. There, scrawled in the same shaky handwriting as the previous entry, was a message that hadn't been there the day before. "They're watching us. They're waiting. Don't look outside." I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. How had it appeared overnight? There was no way we could have missed it the first time. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone sneaking into the cabin while we slept? Was it some kind of twisted joke? I didn't tell Kate about the new entry. I didn't want to scare her. But the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The tapping at the window, the eerie silence of the woods. It all felt connected, like the cabin itself was trying to tell us something. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak, every rustle outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the tapping to start again. But it didn't. Instead, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else, something much worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as they grew closer I could hear them clearly, crunching through the fallen leaves outside. My blood turned to ice as I realized the footsteps were stopping directly outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the sound to go away. But it didn't. Instead, I heard the faintest whisper, so soft, I almost thought I was imagining it. "Don't look outside." I squeezed my eyes shut, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps lingered for what felt like hours before finally fading into the distance. The next morning, we left the cabin. We didn't pack carefully, didn't clean up. We just threw our things into the car and got the hell out of there. I never told Kate about the message I'd found in the guest book, but as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin, sitting there in the woods, as if it were waiting for the next guests. And I couldn't help but wonder who or what was watching us out there in the dark, and what would have happened if we had looked outside. I've always believed that you don't stop for hitchhikers. It's a rule I set for myself early in my career as a long-haul trucker, and I've stuck to it for years. Not because I'm heartless or unwilling to help, but because you hear too many stories out here on the road, the kind that make you think twice about letting a stranger into your cab. So when I spotted the figure standing on the side of the highway that night, thumb outstretched, every instinct I had told me to keep driving. But something was different this time. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the highway was practically deserted. The only light came from the moon hanging low in the sky and the occasional flicker of my headlights bouncing off the reflective signs. I'd been driving for hours, and the hum of the engine had settled into a comforting rhythm. That's when I saw him. A man, standing by the shoulder of the road, alone, with his thumb raised in that universal gesture for "please stop." At first, I thought I'd imagined it. It's not often you see hitchhikers this far out in the middle of nowhere, especially not at this time of night. But as I got closer, there was no mistaking it. He was real, standing tall, wearing what looked like an old, tattered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't seem desperate or panicked, just standing there like he'd been waiting for something, or someone. For a moment, I debated with myself. I'd always told myself I'd never stop, but something about the guy gnawed at me. What if he was stranded? What if he needed help? Maybe his car had broken down, and this stretch of highway didn't exactly get a lot of traffic at night. Against my better judgment, I found myself easing off the gas, slowing the rig until I came to a stop just a few yards ahead of him. "Are you seriously stopping?" I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I didn't know why I was doing this, but something had pulled me in. I glanced in the rearview mirror as the man jogged up to the side of the truck, his figure moving almost too quickly for someone who'd been standing out there in the cold. My hand hesitated over the door lock for a moment before I pressed it, hearing the faint click as the door unlocked. He opened the passenger door and climbed in without a word. The cab felt immediately smaller with him inside, his presence looming larger than I expected. He settled into the seat, pulling the door shut with a quiet thud. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly, almost as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. His face was still partially hidden by the cap, and his jacket looked even more worn up close, frayed at the edges, like it had seen better days. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my gut was tying itself into knots. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road a bit," he said, not offering any specifics. His answer was vague, and something about it made me uneasy. But I'd already let him in, and there wasn't much I could do about it now. I pressed down on the gas, and the truck rumbled back to life, rolling down the empty highway. The cab fell into an awkward silence, with only the hum of the engine and the faint sound of the tires on the asphalt filling the space. I kept my eyes on the road, resisting the urge to glance at him too often. He hadn't said much after climbing in, just staring straight ahead, like he wasn't interested in conversation. After a few minutes, I decided to break the silence. "So, you from around here?" "No," he answered, his voice flat. "Just passing through." I nodded, not pushing for more. He clearly wasn't in the mood to chat, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know much more about him. The miles stretched on, and the longer we drove, the more the unease in my gut grew. It wasn't just the man's silence that was getting to me. It was the way he sat, perfectly still, not fidgeting or moving like most people would. He kept his hands folded in his lap, his face hidden in the shadows from the brim of his cap, almost like he was trying not to be seen too clearly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "So, how'd you end up out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Just when I thought he might ignore me entirely, he spoke, his voice quieter now. "Got stuck. Needed a lift?" I frowned. "Stuck where?" He didn't answer this time, just kept staring ahead, his eyes fixed on the road like he was lost in thought. A cold shiver crept down my spine, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. We passed a mile marker, and I glanced over at him again, hoping he'd give me some indication of where he wanted to be dropped off. But he didn't say anything. His gaze remained locked on the dark highway, like he was waiting for something. My heart started to race. I'd been on the road long enough to know when things didn't feel right, and everything about this situation was setting off alarm bells in my head. "I should be able to drop you off at the next rest stop," I said, my voice a little too loud in the quiet cab. "Shouldn't be too far from here." "No," he said, his voice sharper this time. "I'm not stopping there." A chill ran through me. His tone had changed, and there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "Well, it's the only stop for a while, so I'm afraid that's where I'm headed." For the first time, he turned his head to look at me. I could feel his eyes on me, though I still couldn't see his face clearly under the brim of his cap. But there was something in the way he stared, something that made my stomach twist. I said, "I'm not stopping there." The words hung in the air like a threat, and suddenly the quiet cab felt suffocating. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted, but I knew I didn't want him in my truck any longer. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice calm. "Look, man, I'm just trying to help you out. If you don't want to stop, that's fine, but this is as far as I can take you." Silence again. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the steady thrum of the tires on the road. And then, without warning, he reached up and grabbed the brim of his cap, pulling it down lower over his face. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just drop me off at the next mile marker." I nodded, my heart still racing, and kept my eyes on the road. A few miles passed in tense silence, and when I spotted the next mile marker, I eased the truck over to the shoulder, bringing it to a stop. "Here you go," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hope you find your way." The man didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, closing it softly behind him. I watched in the rearview mirror as he stood there for a moment, staring up at the sky before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stick around to see where he went. As soon as the door was closed, I pressed down on the gas and got the hell out of there, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way. It wasn't until I reached the next truck stop that I finally allowed myself to relax. I pulled into the lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long time, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never saw the man again, and to this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing: I'll never pick up another hitchhiker, no matter how stranded they seem. I've always enjoyed the quiet moments on a cruise, the ones where the world feels still, and the ocean stretches out endlessly in every direction, like you're floating between worlds. It's a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. That's why I was excited when my girlfriend Emily and I booked a week-long cruise. We needed a break, and I couldn't wait to enjoy that serene, isolated feeling. But what I didn't expect was how unsettling that same silence could become when someone, wasn't quite right. It was our second night on the ship when I first noticed her. We were in the dining hall, the usual chatter and clinking of silverware filling the air, when my gaze drifted across the room and landed on an elderly woman sitting by herself. She wasn't eating or talking, just sitting there, staring down at her hands, her white hair neatly pinned up in a way that seemed too formal for the casual atmosphere. What struck me was how still she was. In a room full of movement, she seemed frozen, like a statue. "Do you see her?" I whispered to Emily, nodding in the woman's direction. Emily glanced over, frowning slightly. "Yeah, that's kind of sad. Maybe she's waiting for someone." "Maybe," I said, though something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't stop looking at her. The other tables were full of couples and families chatting and laughing, but she was completely alone, not even a waiter stopping by to check on her. We finished dinner and left the dining hall, and I didn't think much more about the woman that night. I figured she was just a solo traveler or someone who'd lost her companion on the trip, which, in itself, was sad but not unusual. But the next night, when we went back for dinner, she was there again, in the same seat, wearing the same outfit, staring at her hands just like before. "That's weird," I muttered, leaning closer to Emily. "She's still sitting there." Emily shrugged. "Maybe she likes that spot?" I wasn't convinced. Something about the way she sat, so perfectly still, gave me a strange feeling. And once again, no one seemed to be paying her any attention. No waiter, no other passengers, nothing. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting there. It was like she didn't belong. The ship was lively. There were poolside parties, karaoke in the lounge, and even live music at the bar. But she wasn't part of any of it. She was just there in the periphery, existing in her own silent world. The next day, we spent most of our time lounging by the pool and exploring the ship. It was a beautiful day, and for a while, I forgot about the woman. But later that afternoon, as we made our way to one of the lower decks to grab a drink, I saw her again. She was sitting alone on a bench near the window, looking out at the ocean. The light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the hallway, and she was bathed in a golden glow that somehow made her seem even more out of place. Once again, she didn't move. She just sat there, staring ahead with that same blank expression. "That's the third time I've seen her," I whispered to Emily, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Always sitting alone, never talking to anyone. Emily glanced at the woman but didn't seem as bothered by it. Maybe she's just shy, or maybe she likes being alone. Some people do. I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. The ship was full of life, but she seemed disconnected from all of it, like she was just a ghost passing through. That night, after dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about her. As we walked back to our cabin, I decided to ask one of the crew members about her. We passed a young woman in uniform near the elevator, and I stopped her. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "There's an older woman I've seen around the ship. She's always sitting alone, white hair, kind of dressed up. Do you know if she's okay?" The crew member's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for me to notice. She glanced around before answering. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not sure who you're referring to. We have a lot of passengers." I frowned. "She's been in the dining hall the last 2 nights, always in the same spot." The crew member gave me a tight-lipped smile. "I'll make a note to check on her, but if you don't mind, we ask that guests not disturb other passengers' privacy." Her response didn't sit right with me. It was too vague, like she was brushing me off. But I didn't push it. Emily was already tugging on my arm, urging me to let it go. "Just forget about it," Emily said as we reached our cabin. "She's probably fine. You're overthinking it." But I couldn't forget about it. The next night, I insisted we sit near the woman's table in the dining hall. I wanted to get a closer look, maybe even strike up a conversation. I figured if I could talk to her, it would put my mind at ease. Maybe she really was just a quiet, lonely traveler. When we walked into the dining hall, I immediately spotted her, sitting in the same chair, at the same table, wearing the same outfit. I led Emily to a table just a few feet away, close enough that I could watch her without being too obvious. She hadn't moved since we'd come in, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her, her head slightly bowed as if she were deep in thought. We ordered our food, and I spent most of the meal sneaking glances in her direction. The more I watched, the more unnerved I became. It wasn't just her stillness that was unsettling. It was the fact that no one seemed to notice her. The waiters walked past her table without stopping. The other guests didn't so much as glance her way. It was like she didn't exist. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, determined to go over and say something, even if it was just a polite hello. But as I approached her table, I stopped in my tracks. Her chair was empty. I blinked, sure I'd seen her just moments before. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of her. The dining hall was bustling with people, but the woman was gone, vanished without a trace. I turned back to Emily, who was watching me with wide eyes. What happened? Where did she go? I don't know, I stammered, feeling the weight of the room pressing in on me. She was just here. We left the dining hall quickly, both of us spooked by the sudden disappearance. Back in the cabin, I tried to make sense of it. How could she have disappeared so suddenly? She hadn't left the dining hall, I would have seen her. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to figure out where she could have gone, but no matter how many times I thought it over, I couldn't come up with an explanation that made sense. The next morning, I asked another crew member about her, describing her in detail. But again, I got the same vague response. No one fitting that description was listed as a passenger on the ship. For the rest of the cruise, I didn't see the woman again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, somewhere on the ship, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the ship was quiet and the only sound was the gentle rocking of the waves, I could almost hear the faint whisper of her presence, just out of sight. It was like she was still sitting at that table, still staring at her hands, waiting for someone to notice her. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was, but I've been on plenty of cruises since, and I always find myself scanning the dining hall, looking for her. And every time I wonder if she's still out there, quietly waiting for someone to see her, because I did. There's a certain sinking feeling you get when your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. It's like all the safety and security you feel inside the metal shell of your car just evaporates, leaving you exposed, vulnerable. That's exactly how I felt the night my car decided to die on a lonely stretch of road, miles away from any town or gas station. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon and my hazard lights flashing in the dark. I'd been driving back from a weekend visit to a friend's cabin, taking the scenic route through rural roads, which now felt like a mistake. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and my phone, of course, had no signal. Classic, right? There I was, stranded, miles from anywhere, with no way to call for help and no clue what had gone wrong with the engine. I tried to restart the car for what must have been the 10th time. The engine made that sad sputtering sound again, but it wasn't catching. I slumped back in my seat, staring out at the empty road ahead, wondering how long I'd be stuck out here. And that's when I saw the headlights. They were faint at first, just a glimmer in the distance, but they were definitely there. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone could give me a lift to the nearest town, or at least let me use their phone to call for a tow. I climbed out of the car and stood by the side of the road, waving my arms as the vehicle approached. The car, a beat-up old truck, slowed to a stop just a few feet in front of me. The engine idled softly as the driver rolled down the window. He was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a weathered jacket. His face was shadowed, but I could see enough to tell he had a serious, no-nonsense look about him. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. I nodded. "Yeah, it just died on me. I can't get it to start again, and my phone's got no signal out here." The man glanced down at my car, then back at me. "You want me to take a look?" I hesitated for a moment. Something about the way he asked the question gave me pause, but I quickly shook it off. I was stranded, and he was offering help. What choice did I have? "That'd be great. Thanks," I said, stepping aside to let him take a look under the hood. He climbed out of the truck and walked over to my car, popping the hood and shining a flashlight into the engine. I stood by, trying to stay out of his way, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. The way the beam of his flashlight flickered over the engine and his silence as he worked made the night feel even darker, even quieter. "Looks like your alternator might be shot," he said after a minute, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "That's why it won't turn over." I had no idea what that meant. I'm not exactly the most mechanically inclined person, so I just nodded, hoping that sounded right. Is it fixable? Not out here, he said, closing the hood with a heavy thud. You'll need a tow. Great, I thought. Just what I needed. I can give you a ride to the nearest town, he offered, motioning to his truck. It's not too far, about 20 miles down the road. Again, I hesitated. 20 miles. That seemed like a long way to go, especially in the middle of the night. But what choice did I have? I wasn't going to get anywhere sitting out here with a dead car. Yeah, okay, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. That'd be a huge help. He nodded, his face still shadowed under the brim of his cap, and gestured for me to get in the truck. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat of my car and slid into the passenger seat of his truck, the worn leather creaking beneath me. The interior smelled faintly of old cigarettes and motor oil, but it was warm, and for that, I was grateful. The truck rumbled back to life, and we pulled back onto the dark road. The silence between us was thick, and the only sound came from the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the truck's suspension as we hit a bump in the road. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur by in the dim glow of the headlights, trying to push down the nervous feeling gnawing at my gut. So, do you live around here? I asked, trying to break the tension. He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the road. Not too far. I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, the silence stretched out again, heavier than before. As we drove, I couldn't help but notice that the road didn't seem to be heading anywhere. There were no signs, no mile markers, and no hint of a town in the distance, just endless trees, stretching out on either side of us. My unease grew with each passing minute. How far did you say the town was? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Not too far, he repeated, his tone the same as before. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the dashboard, hoping for some clue as to where we were, but there was nothing to indicate we were getting closer to anything. No street signs, no buildings, just darkness. I shifted in my seat, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. I don't mean to be rude, but are we still headed toward town? The man didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his face expressionless, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost amused. We're getting there. That was it. That was the moment when my unease turned to full-blown fear. Something wasn't right. We'd been driving for what felt like far too long, and there was no sign of civilization. No other cars, no lights, just the empty, endless road stretching out into the night. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. You know what? Maybe I should go back to the car, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I think I'll just wait for the morning when I can get a tow. The man didn't respond right away, but I could feel the tension in the air thickening. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to stop. But then, without a word, he slowed the truck down, pulling off to the side of the road. I breathed a sigh of relief as he brought the truck to a stop. Thanks for the ride, I muttered, fumbling with the door handle. I'll just... Before I could finish, he reached across the seat, his hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. You sure you want to get out here? He asked, his voice cold and quiet. We're in the middle of nowhere. No one's gonna find you out here. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His grip tightened for a second, just long enough to send a wave of panic through me. But then, just as suddenly, he let go. Suit yourself, he said, leaning back in his seat, his expression unreadable. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I yanked open the door, scrambling out of the truck and onto the side of the road. My heart was pounding, my mind racing as I slammed the door shut behind me. The man sat there for a moment, watching me from the driver's seat, his eyes hidden in the shadows. Then, without another word, He pulled back onto the road and drove off, the taillights of his truck disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, my heart still racing, the sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance. The cold night air wrapped around me, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of that truck. I never found out what that man's intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. But from that night on, I made myself another rule. If your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, be careful who you accept help from, because sometimes getting a ride is more dangerous than being stranded. There's something about camping that makes you feel like you're stepping outside of time. The fire crackles, the stars shimmer overhead, and the quiet of the wilderness surrounds you. It's a kind of peace that you can't find in the city, where the hum of life never really stops. That's why my buddies and I made it a point to take these trips into the woods as often as we could. But one particular trip, the last one we ever took, still sticks with me. Not for the peace or the beauty of the forest, but because of what happened during the long, dark hours when the fire burned low and the night felt too quiet. It was just the three of us that weekend, me, Matt, and Kyle. We'd picked a campsite deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, right by a small, isolated lake. It was perfect. No other campers around, just trees and water as far as the eye could see. We set up our tents, got the fire going, and spent the day fishing and joking around like we always did. Everything felt normal, and by the time the sun started to set, we were relaxed and ready to settle in for the night. As the darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. Matt was in the middle of telling some ridiculous ghost story when we heard the first sound. It was a faint rustling just beyond the light of the fire. At first, we all thought it was a raccoon or maybe a deer wandering through the trees. "You hear that?" Kyle asked, peering into the darkness. "Probably just an animal," I said, though my ears were already straining to pick up any other sounds. The woods around us had been quiet all evening, and now, with the night fully settled in, every noise felt amplified. Matt waved it off, laughing. "Dude, we're in the middle of the woods. Of course there's going to be animals." We all agreed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rustling had stopped, but the hairs on the back of my neck were still standing up. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced at the edge of the trees, and for the first time since we'd arrived, the woods felt a little too still. We tried to brush it off, focusing on keeping the conversation light, but the mood had shifted. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just beyond the fire's glow. After a while, we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the chill in the air had grown sharper. We put out the remaining flames, packed away the food, and retreated to our tents. I zipped mine up and lay down, listening to the soft rustling of the trees outside, trying to calm the unease that had settled deep in my gut. That's when the footsteps started. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A soft, rhythmic crunching, like someone walking slowly through the underbrush. My heart rate spiked, and I held my breath, straining to listen. It was faint, but unmistakable, steady footsteps, moving just outside the circle of tents. I sat up, my hand reaching for the flashlight I'd left by my sleeping bag. I hesitated for a second, not wanting to alert Matt or Kyle if it was nothing, but the sound continued. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk like that. This was deliberate. I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out, shining the flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no figure, nothing but the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the campsite, moving slowly, methodically, like someone was pacing just outside our reach. I crawled out of the tent, my heart pounding in my chest, and quietly made my way over to Matt's tent. "Hey," I whispered, tapping on the side. "Matt, you awake?" It took a moment, but Matt finally unzipped his tent, blinking groggily. "What's up?" "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to speak too loudly, didn't want to give away the fact that I was onto whatever, or whoever, was out there. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "The footsteps," I said, glancing nervously toward the trees. "Someone's out there, walking around." Matt listened for a second, his expression slowly changing as he, too, picked up on the sound. His eyes widened, and he nodded, suddenly fully awake. We woke Kyle next, and the three of us stood there in the middle of the campsite, flashlights in hand, listening. The footsteps were still there, circling us. They never got closer, never moved farther away, just kept circling. "We should call out," Kyle suggested, his voice shaky. "Maybe it's just someone lost or messing with us." But none of us moved. Something about the sound, the deliberate, unhurried pace, made my skin crawl. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They weren't trying to find their way back to the trail. They were watching us. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the tension between us, all of us waiting, listening, hoping the sound wouldn't start again. "Okay," Matt whispered, his voice tight. "Let's just get back in the tents. We'll pack up first thing in the morning and get out of here." I nodded, but as I turned back to my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep was out of the question. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch had me on edge. Hours passed in a tense, sleepless silence. I don't know what time it was, but at some point, I must have dozed off. It wasn't until the faint light of dawn started creeping through the trees that I finally started to relax, convinced that the worst was over. But just as I was beginning to drift into a deeper sleep, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a low, steady breathing, coming from right outside my tent. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, frozen, my heart racing. The sound was soft but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing just inches from where I lay, breathing slowly, deeply. I didn't dare move. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Didn't want to let whoever or whatever was out there know that I was awake. I just lay there, listening, every muscle in my body tensed. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing finally stopped. There was a long, agonizing silence. And then, the faint sound of footsteps again, moving away from the tent, back into the trees. I waited until I was sure the sound was gone, then slowly, quietly, unzipped the tent and crawled out into the dim morning light. Matt and Kyle were already up, packing their gear in tense silence. Neither of them said a word, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They'd heard it too. We packed up as quickly as we could, not bothering with breakfast or even talking about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there, back to civilization, back to safety. As we hiked back to the car, the forest seemed different, less welcoming, more oppressive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. But the woods were empty, as if whatever had been out there during the night had vanished with the sunrise. We never talked about that trip again. It wasn't like we made some kind of pact not to. It was just one of those things you don't bring up, like a bad dream you'd rather forget. But I'll never forget that night. The way the footsteps circled our camp, the sound of the breathing just outside my tent, and I haven't been camping since. There's a weird sort of calm that comes over you when you're driving alone at night. It's just you, the empty road, and the hum of your tires against the asphalt. It's peaceful, in a way, until it isn't. Until something makes you realize just how isolated you really are. That's what happened to me one night when I pulled into a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, thinking I'd catch a quick break. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone, certainly not him. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it back home after a weekend away. It was late, well past midnight, and the road had been dead for miles. No cars, no lights, just the occasional reflective road sign flashing past. I could feel the exhaustion creeping up on me, so when I spotted a sign for a rest stop ahead, I figured it was a good chance to stretch my legs and maybe grab a quick nap before getting back on the road. The rest stop was nothing special, just a small lot with a couple of vending machines and a bathroom. The kind of place you stop at when there's nothing else around, but you're too tired to keep going. I pulled in, parked under one of the dim streetlights, and cut the engine. The light flickered overhead, casting a pale glow over the empty lot. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the cold air hit me. It was that sharp, biting kind of cold that comes when you're deep in the middle of nowhere. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and headed toward the vending machines, hoping to grab a soda or something to keep me awake for the next leg of the trip. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was alone, but as I approached the vending machines, I noticed a figure standing just at the edge of the light, leaning against the wall by the bathrooms. He was tall, with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a long, dark coat. The hood of the coat was pulled up, obscuring most of his face, but I could tell he was watching me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. Something about the way he stood, so still and so silent, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, staring. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe he was just another traveler, waiting for someone, taking a break like I was. But there was something about his presence that felt off. I fumbled for my wallet, trying to focus on the vending machine, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. My fingers trembled slightly as I fed a few bills into the machine and pressed the button for a soda. The can clattered down into the tray, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. I grabbed the can and turned to leave, hoping to make it back to my car without any kind of interaction. But as soon as I took a step, the man spoke. "Long night, huh?" His voice was low, raspy, and sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped, glancing over at him, unsure if I should respond. He hadn't moved from his spot, still leaning against the wall, his face mostly hidden in shadow. "Yeah," I said, forcing a small smile, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just passing through." He didn't respond right away, just kept staring. The silence between us stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, until finally, he spoke again. "Where are you headed?" Something about the question made me pause. It wasn't just the question itself, it was the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to confirm it. "Home," I said, keeping my response short, my nerves on edge. Again, he didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and unsettling. The whole situation felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand. "You shouldn't stop here," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not tonight." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "This place," he said, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "It's not safe. Not for people like you." A cold chill ran down my spine. People like me. What did that mean? I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "I'm just passing through," I repeated, trying to sound calm, though my hands were shaking now. "I'll be gone in a minute." "You should leave now," he said, his voice a little sharper this time, "before it gets dark." I stared at him, confused. It was already dark, and had been for hours. What was he talking about? "Look," I said, backing toward my car. "I'm just trying to get home." For the first time, the man moved, stepping out of the shadow and into the pale light of the flickering street lamp. I finally got a good look at his face, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. His skin was pale, almost sickly, with deep shadows under his eyes. But it wasn't just that. There was something off about his expression, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. His eyes were too wide, too focused, as if he were waiting for something to happen. "Get in your car," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Drive. Now." I didn't need to be told again. My heart was pounding in my chest as I scrambled back to my car, fumbling with my keys in my haste to unlock the door. I glanced back at the man one last time as I climbed into the driver's seat, but he was already gone, vanished into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the rest stop, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped back onto the highway. For the first few miles, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the middle of the road behind me. But the highway was empty, just an endless stretch of darkness and the distant glow of the moon. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? And what had he meant when he said it wasn't safe? I still don't know. But here's the thing. About an hour after I left that rest stop, I heard about an accident on the same stretch of highway. A car had lost control and crashed into the trees near the rest stop I'd been at. The driver didn't make it. They said he'd likely fallen asleep at the wheel, exhausted from a long drive. And ever since then, I've wondered, if I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't met that strange man who told me to leave, would that have been me? I don't know who he was or how he knew, but I've never stopped at a rest stop like that again, and I don't think I ever will. You know that feeling when something just doesn't sit right, like a strange heaviness that settles in the pit of your stomach, even though everything looks perfectly normal on the surface. That's the feeling I had the moment we stepped onto that trail. It was supposed to be an easy hike, a simple out and back through a popular park. But that day, the woods felt different. And by the time I realized how wrong everything was, it was already too late. I'd been hiking with my best friend Lucas Nia for years. It was our thing, getting away from the city, clearing our heads in the peace and quiet of nature. We'd covered trails all over the country, from dense forest to towering mountain ranges. But this time, we decided to keep it simple and stick to a trail we both knew well, one we'd hiked a dozen times before. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the light filters through the trees in golden beams, and the forest feels alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Nothing unusual, just another day on the trail. We parked at the trailhead, laced up our boots, and set off, our backpacks light with just the essentials: water, snacks, a map. Not that we thought we'd need it. The first half of the hike was perfect. The trail was well worn, winding through the trees with the familiar crunch of dirt and leaves underfoot. We talked about work, weekend plans, and the usual stuff. Lucas was always the faster hiker, so he stayed ahead, setting a pace that kept me working to keep up. I didn't mind, though. The exercise felt good, and the woods had a way of calming my mind. But around the halfway point, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. The sunlight that had been streaming through the trees suddenly felt dimmer, like a cloud had passed in front of the sun, even though the sky had been clear when we started. The birds that had been chirping all around us had gone quiet, and the usual hum of the forest seemed to fade into a heavy, unnatural silence. I didn't say anything at first, thinking I was just imagining things. But after another mile or so, the silence became impossible to ignore. "Do you hear that?" I called out to Lucas, who was a few paces ahead. He slowed down, turning to look at me with a puzzled expression. Hear what? Exactly, I said, stopping in my tracks. It's too quiet. Where are the birds? Where's the wind? Lucas shrugged, but I could tell he felt it too. I don't know. Maybe we're just in a weird pocket of the woods or something. I wasn't convinced. We'd hiked this trail enough times to know that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the woods were holding their breath. Still, we pressed on. The trail was supposed to loop around, leading us back to the car within an hour or two, so I figured we'd push through and be back at the trailhead soon enough. But as we kept walking, the trail began to change. The trees, which had been spaced out and familiar, started to grow closer together, their branches twisting and intertwining overhead like a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The dirt path beneath our feet became narrower, more uneven, and soon, we found ourselves stepping over large roots and rocks that hadn't been there before. "Are you sure we're still on the trail?" I asked, my voice tight with unease. Lucas pulled out the map, glancing at it before looking around. "I think so," he said, though there was hesitation in his voice. The trail markers should be up ahead. But there weren't any markers. The further we went, the more the trail seemed to disappear, swallowed by the dense forest. The trees loomed over us, casting long shadows that made it hard to tell where the trail ended and the woods began. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas stopped, turning to face me with a frown. "I think we should head back," he said, his voice low. "This doesn't feel right." I nodded, relieved that he was finally admitting what I'd been feeling for the past hour. "Yeah, let's go." We turned around and started retracing our steps, but something was wrong. The path we'd come down didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer together, the underbrush thicker, and the familiar landmarks we'd passed, like the fallen log near the creek, were nowhere to be seen. "We didn't come this way," I muttered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did we?" Lucas didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the dense woods around us. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "But we'll figure it out. Let's just keep moving." We walked for what felt like hours, but the more we tried to backtrack, the more lost we became. The trail, which had been so clear and obvious when we started, had vanished completely, swallowed by the forest. The trees pressed in on us from all sides, and the silence was suffocating. Panic started to creep in. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, in the way my breath came faster and my steps grew quicker. Lucas, always the calm one, was starting to show signs of frustration too. He kept checking the map, even though it was useless now. Nothing around us matched what was on the page. At one point, we came to a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by trees so thick, it was like a wall of wood and leaves. I glanced at Lucas, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "We're going in circles," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe it. But he was right. The same clearing we'd stumbled into earlier was now in front of us again, even though we'd been walking in a straight line for what felt like miles. "This doesn't make any sense," I said, my voice shaking. "We should have been out of here by now." Lucas didn't say anything. He just stared at the ground, his jaw clenched, as if trying to figure out what to do next. "We need to stay calm," he said finally, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "We'll find our way out. We just need to." Before he could finish, something moved in the trees. It was just a flicker of movement, out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart racing, but whatever it was had already disappeared. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lucas shook his head. "See what?" "There's something out there," I said, my throat dry. "I saw something move." Lucas scanned the trees, but the woods were still, the shadows long and deep. "You're just spooked," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. There's nothing out there. But I knew what I'd seen. Something, or someone, was watching us. We stood there for a long moment, both of us on edge, waiting for something to happen. But the forest remained silent, the trees unmoving. Finally, Lucas broke the tension. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find the trail again. We have to." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew we were in trouble. We were lost, and the woods weren't giving us any clues as to how to get out. We walked for hours, maybe longer. The sky, which had been bright and clear when we started, had turned a dull, oppressive gray. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched as we made our way through the trees, but the trail never reappeared. As night began to fall, Lucas and I made a decision we never wanted to make. We'd camp here in the middle of the unknown. We found a flat patch of ground, set up our tent, and tried to convince ourselves that everything would be fine in the morning. But as the darkness closed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We never found our way back to the car. The next day, a search party did. They found Lucas's gear near the trailhead, neatly packed away. But me? I never came back. It's strange how certain places can get under your skin. You pass them day after day, never giving them much thought, but then one day, something changes. A shift in the light, a shadow where there wasn't one before, and suddenly you can't stop thinking about it. That's how it was with the old barn on the outskirts of town. I'd driven past it 100 times, never really paying attention, until that one evening when I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me from the dark windows. The barn was a relic of a time long gone, tucked away at the edge of a field that had long since been left to grow wild. The roof sagged in places, and the wood had weathered to a grayish hue, but it still stood, looming over the landscape like a forgotten monument. Nobody ever went there, as far as I knew. The land it sat on had been abandoned years ago when the owners passed away, and the property had been left to rot. That day I was coming back from work, taking the usual back roads, when I felt it. A cold chill ran down my spine, and my eyes drifted to the barn. It was just sitting there like always, but something about it looked different. The windows were black, darker than they should have been with the fading daylight, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement inside. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. I was probably just tired, but as I drove past, I found myself slowing down, my gaze locked on the barn. I don't know what came over me, but before I even realized what I was doing, I'd pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out of the car. The air was cool, carrying the scent of the overgrown grass that swayed lazily in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, staring at the barn, my heart pounding a little harder than it should have been. It was just an old building, after all. There was nothing to be afraid of. But that didn't stop the unease from creeping in as I crossed the field toward it. With each step, the barn seemed to grow taller, more imposing. The closer I got, the more I could see just how dilapidated it really was. The windows were grimy, covered in years of dust and cobwebs, and the wooden doors hung slightly ajar, creaking ever so slightly in the breeze. I stopped in front of the doors, my hand hovering over the rough wood. Part of me wanted to turn around and go back to the safety of my car, to forget I'd ever stopped. But there was another part of me, a part I couldn't ignore, that needed to know what was inside. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly in the silence, and the smell of damp wood and dust hit me as I stepped inside. The barn was bigger than it looked from the outside, the high rafters disappearing into shadow. The only light came from the few cracks in the walls where the setting sun filtered through, casting thin beams of light across the dirt floor. At first glance, the place seemed empty. Just old farm equipment, a few broken crates, and piles of hay that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But as I ventured further in, something caught my eye. In the far corner, Partially hidden behind a stack of rotting wood was an old ladder leading up to a loft. It was rickety and worn, the kind of thing you wouldn't trust to hold your weight. But there was something strange about it, something that made me feel like it hadn't always been there. I hesitated, glancing around the barn one last time before making my way to the ladder. My heart was racing now, and every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get back in my car and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was up there. The ladder creaked under my weight, and for a moment, I thought it might give way. But somehow, I made it to the top. The loft was small, just a cramped space tucked under the barn's roof, with the same smell of damp and decay that filled the rest of the building. But there, in the middle of the floor, was something that didn't belong. A wooden chest. It was old, much older than anything else in the barn. The wood was dark and polished, with intricate carvings that had been worn smooth with time. A thick layer of dust covered it, but it looked untouched, like it had been hidden up here for years, waiting for someone to find it. My hands were shaking as I knelt down in front of the chest, brushing away the dust. The carvings were strange, almost like symbols, though I couldn't quite make out what they were supposed to represent. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the latch, before finally giving in to the curiosity that had led me this far. The latch clicked open, and I lifted the lid. Inside the chest, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a small, weathered journal. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were still intact, their edges yellowed with age. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling as I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping, and elegant, but the words themselves were barely legible. Faded, almost erased, as if someone had tried to remove them. I squinted, trying to make sense of the faint script. November 17th, 1922. It's here. I saw it again tonight, in the barn, watching me from the shadows. It's always watching. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The nights are worse now. It won't let me sleep. I can feel it. Waiting. A cold chill ran down my spine as I read the words. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the journal. What was this? Who had written it? And what had they seen in the barn? I flipped through the pages, but most of the entries were just as faint, the words barely visible, as if someone, or something, had been trying to erase them from existence. But one thing was clear. Whoever had written this had been terrified. Something had haunted them in this barn, something they couldn't escape. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the barn, and I froze. I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stood up, clutching the journal to my chest. The sound had come from below, from the barn floor. Someone, or something, was down there, moving around. I edged toward the ladder, my hands slick with sweat, as the sound of footsteps grew louder. I peered over the edge, my breath catching in my throat. The barn was empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still there, pacing around the barn, moving in slow, deliberate circles. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't make out a figure in the dim light, but I could feel it, the same presence that the journal had described, the same sense of being watched. I scrambled down the ladder, my hands slipping on the worn wood, and bolted for the door. The footsteps followed, growing faster, closer, as if something was chasing me, something I couldn't see. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I burst out of the barn and ran across the field, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My car was still parked on the side of the road, the engine still off, the world still silent, but the feeling, the presence, was still there, watching me, following me as I raced toward the safety of my car. I didn't stop until I was back behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the barn, the journal still clutched in my hands. My heart didn't stop pounding until the barn had disappeared in my rearview mirror. swallowed by the fading light of the evening. I never went back to that barn, never told anyone what I'd found, what I'd heard. But sometimes, late at night, I take out the journal and stare at the pages, the faint words that still haunt me. And I wonder, what was watching me in that barn? And is it still there, waiting for someone else to find it? Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was wrong before you even realized what it was? It's like your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet, and all you can do is trust that instinct. That's exactly how I felt when we pulled into that empty campsite. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods, just me and a couple of friends. But from the moment we arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small, like a whisper at the back of my mind, telling me that the place was off somehow. It was nothing I could put my finger on, and I didn't want to be that person, the one who ruins a good trip with paranoia. But as we unpacked the car and set up our tents, the feeling only grew stronger. We had driven a few hours out of town, deep into a national forest where the trees stretched for miles and the sound of civilization was left far behind. The campsite wasn't on any official map, but Kyle, one of my best friends, had found it online through some outdoor enthusiast forum. He said it was off the beaten path, perfect for getting away from everything. I liked the idea in theory, peace and quiet, no other campers, no distractions, but standing there, surrounded by nothing but trees, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. Pretty cool, right? Kyle grinned as he tossed a bag of firewood onto the ground. We've got the whole place to ourselves. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. Definitely secluded. Emily, my girlfriend, was already pulling out the cooler, humming to herself. She didn't seem bothered by the isolation, but then again, she was always more adventurous than I was. She loved these trips, the chance to disconnect, but I found myself glancing around more than I usually did, scanning the tree line like I was expecting to see something. The afternoon passed without incident. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and laughed about old times, the usual camping stuff. But even as the sun started to set and the glow of the fire flickered warmly against the trees, I couldn't relax. There was something strange about how quiet the woods were. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind rustling through the branches. Just the crackling of our fire and our voices echoing too loudly in the stillness. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Emily said, nudging me playfully. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't push it, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Still, we settled into a comfortable rhythm, passing the time with stories and jokes, and eventually, I managed to push the unease to the back of my mind. But as the night wore on, things started to feel even stranger. Around midnight, we all decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the temperature had dropped enough that the idea of crawling into our sleeping bags sounded more appealing than staying up any longer. I zipped up our tent and lay down next to Emily, staring at the canvas above me as she quickly drifted off to sleep. The woods outside were still deathly quiet, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a faint sound, like someone or something was moving outside the tent. I sat up, my heart immediately pounding in my chest. The sound was subtle, just the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. But in the absolute silence of the forest, it might as well have been thunder. I listened, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just Kyle heading to the trees for a bathroom break or some animal wandering too close to camp. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too slow. I gently shook Emily awake. "Hey, do you hear that?" She groaned softly, half asleep. "What?" There's someone outside," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Emily blinked, her tired brain trying to catch up. It's probably Kyle. But I wasn't so sure. I glanced toward the small mesh window of the tent, but it was too dark to see anything. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite bathed in shadows. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the oppressive silence of the woods pressing in on all sides. I slowly unzipped the tent, careful not to make any noise, and poked my head out. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the campsite, but there was no sign of anyone. Kyle's tent was still zipped up, his silhouette faintly visible inside. Whatever had been moving around wasn't him. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, or anything. Just the empty campsite and the dark woods beyond. Emily sat up behind me, her voice quiet but tense. "Do you see anything?" I shook my head, still staring out into the darkness. "No, but something's out there." We waited for what felt like forever, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. After a while, Emily convinced me to lay back down, though I didn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound to return, but it never did. Morning came, and with the sunlight, my anxiety from the night before felt almost foolish. Almost. The woods looked normal again. The unease from the previous night faded, though not completely gone. Kyle was already up, poking at the remnants of the fire, oblivious to the strange tension that had settled over me and Emily. "Morning," he called cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Yeah," I lied again. "You?" "Like a rock," he grinned. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. It felt silly now, like maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it really was just an animal. But that nagging feeling in my gut didn't go away. Something had been out there. The plan was to pack up after breakfast and head back to town, but as we started gathering our things, we noticed something odd. The path we'd taken to get to the campsite, the one that had been so clear when we arrived, was gone. Completely. We stood there, confused, staring at the dense trees where the trail should have been. I was sure we'd come this way. The car wasn't far, just a short hike through the woods. But now, there was no sign of the trail. It was like the forest had swallowed it up overnight. "That doesn't make any sense," Kyle muttered, scratching his head. "It was right here." "Are you sure we're looking in the right spot?" Emily asked, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. "Yeah, this is it," I said, my heart starting to race again. We didn't come that far. The trail was right here. We spent the next hour circling the campsite, trying to find the path we'd taken the day before, but it was gone, completely gone. The trees, which had seemed familiar when we arrived, now looked the same in every direction. No markers, no trail, just endless woods. Panic started to set in. We had no cell signal, no map, nothing to help us find our way back. We were completely disoriented, and the more we searched, the more lost we became. "We need to stay calm," Kyle said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "We'll find it. We just need to retrace our steps." But there were no steps to retrace. The woods had changed overnight, twisted into something unrecognizable. It was like the forest itself had decided we weren't going anywhere. By late afternoon, the tension was unbearable. The silence that had unnerved me the day before was back, heavier than ever. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment. As the sun started to dip below the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite, I realized something else, something that made my blood run cold. We weren't the first ones to get lost here. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the underbrush, was the remnants of an old campsite. Torn tents, rusted cans, and a half-buried cooler, like someone had been here before, and like us, They'd never left. I don't know what happened to them, and I don't know what's going to happen to us. But if you're ever driving through these woods and think about stopping to camp, don't. There are some things you just don't forget, no matter how much time passes. The kind of experiences that settle in the back of your mind, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. For me, it was the year I spent in college, sharing an apartment with a guy no one else seemed to remember. At first, I thought it was all in my head, that maybe I was just misinterpreting things. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized that something wasn't right. It was my sophomore year when I moved off campus into a small 2-bedroom apartment. The place wasn't fancy, cheap rent, worn-down carpets, and a view of the parking lot. But it was a step up from the dorms, and I was glad to have my own space. When I first signed the lease, I was told I'd have a roommate, someone named David, who had already been living there for a year. That was fine by me. I'd always gotten along with my roommates in the past, so I didn't expect any problems. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. David kept to himself most of the time, rarely leaving his room except for the occasional trip to the kitchen or bathroom. We exchanged pleasantries, but there was never much conversation. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people are just quiet, I figured. He was probably busy with schoolwork or something. But then things started to feel off. It began with small things. I'd come home after class and find the door to David's room slightly ajar, even though I knew I hadn't seen him leave. Or I'd hear strange noises at night, soft footsteps, faint whispers coming from his room, even when I thought he wasn't home. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just hearing things. Maybe the apartment had thin walls, and the sounds were coming from the neighbors. One night, I came home late from studying at the library. The apartment was dark, and David's door was closed, as usual. I figured he was asleep, so I quietly made my way to my room, not wanting to disturb him. As I passed his door, though, I noticed something strange. There was a light coming from under the door, but it wasn't the usual warm glow of a lamp or overhead light. It was faint, almost like the light from a screen, flickering. I paused, debating whether or not to knock, but something stopped me. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood there for a moment longer before deciding to leave it alone. Whatever David was doing in there was his business, and I didn't want to be nosy. The next morning, I got up early for class and noticed something odd. David's door was wide open, but his room was completely empty. The bed was made, the desk cleared, and there were no signs that anyone had been in there recently. I stood in the doorway for a moment, confused. Had he left early? Maybe he had a class or something. But as I glanced around the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, I ran into a mutual friend, Sarah, at the campus coffee shop. We got to chatting, and I mentioned David, asking if she knew him. She gave me a blank look. "David? Who's that?" I frowned. "My roommate. He's been living with me for a few months now." Sarah shook her head, laughing. "I thought you lived alone." I stared at her, completely baffled. "No, I definitely have a roommate. His name's David. You've probably just never met him. He keeps to himself a lot." But Sarah didn't seem convinced. "I've never heard you mention him before, and you've always said it's just you in that apartment." The conversation left me unsettled. How could Sarah not know about David? We'd been friends for years, and I'd definitely mentioned him in passing before. Hadn't I? Over the next few weeks, things only got stranger. David's presence became more and more inconsistent. Some days, I'd come home, and it was like he wasn't even there. No sounds from his room, no dishes left in the sink. Other days, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of him as he moved around the apartment, but he never stayed long enough for a conversation. It was like he was slipping in and out of existence. One night, after a long day of classes and work, I sat down to dinner with some friends. The topic of roommates came up, and I mentioned David again. "Wait," one of my friends said, setting her fork down. "You've been living with someone this whole time. I thought you had a single apartment." I looked around the table, confused. "Yeah, David. I've told you guys about him before." But they all shook their heads. "You've never mentioned a David," another friend said, furrowing her brow. "Are you sure you're not mixing things up?" A cold chill ran down my spine. How could they not remember? I was certain I'd talked about David before, at least in passing, but the more they insisted, the more I began to doubt myself. Had I really been living with someone, or had I just imagined the whole thing? That night, I went home, my mind racing. I stood outside David's door, staring at it, wondering if I should knock. I needed to talk to him, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But something about the silence coming from the other side of the door made me hesitate. I turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open. The room was empty, completely empty. There were no clothes in the closet, no books on the desk, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The bed was stripped bare, and the walls were blank, like a room that had been uninhabited for months. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this be possible? David had been living with me. He'd been here. I'd seen him. We'd talked, shared the same space. I wasn't imagining it. I couldn't be. But as I looked around the room, a horrible thought began to creep into my mind. What if David had never existed? I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment felt different now, colder, emptier. I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. I kept telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe David had moved out while I was at class. Maybe he was playing some kind of prank on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I went to the apartment office to ask about David, hoping they'd have some answers. When I asked about my roommate, the woman behind the desk gave me a strange look. "David," she repeated, flipping through her files. "There's no one by that name listed on your lease. You've been living there alone since you moved in." I stared at her, my heart sinking. "That's not possible. He's been there the whole time." She shook her head. "I'm sorry. But there's no record of anyone else living in your apartment." I left the office in a daze, my mind spinning. How could this be happening? How could I have lived with someone for months, only for him to vanish without a trace? No one else remembered him. There was no evidence he'd ever been there. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Maybe David was real, and he simply disappeared without anyone noticing. Maybe he was some kind of figment of my imagination, a creation of my mind. Or maybe there was something darker at play, something I'll never fully understand. But one thing's for sure, I've never felt truly alone in that apartment since. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps, the quiet creak of a door opening and closing, like someone is still there, like David is still there, watching, waiting, and I don't think he's ever really left. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night, one of those that jolts you awake with a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. I wasn't sure why I'd even answered it, especially since I didn't recognize the number, but something about the incessant ringing made me feel like I had to. You know that feeling. Like it's not just a phone call, but something important, something you can't ignore. I wish I hadn't picked up that night, though. I wish I'd just let it ring. The voice on the other end was faint, almost muffled, like they were speaking from far away, or through a bad connection. It was hard to make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable. They were scared. There was panic in their voice, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you don't know what's coming next. "Help me," they whispered. "Please, help me." I sat up in bed, fully awake now, my heart racing. Who is this? But there was no answer. just the soft crackle of static and the faint sound of heavy breathing. For a moment, I thought it might be a prank, but something about the fear in that voice felt too real. "Who is this?" I asked again, louder this time. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Maybe it was just a wrong number, I told myself. Someone had called the wrong person, realized their mistake, and hung up. But as I lay back down, the voice echoed in my mind, "Please, help me." The next day, I tried to forget about the call. It was probably nothing, just someone in distress who dialed the wrong number. But the voice, it stuck with me. There was something in the way they'd said, "Help me," something that felt like more than just fear. It felt like desperation. Still, I convinced myself it was best to leave it alone. A week passed with no more strange calls, and I started to think maybe it was just an isolated incident. But then, late one night, it happened again. The phone rang, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately. "Hello?" Again. There was a long pause, the same crackling static, the same faint breathing on the other end. I felt my chest tighten with that same inexplicable dread, my pulse quickening as I waited for the voice. "Please, help me," they whispered, just like before. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want?" The line crackled, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else in the background, like the sound of footsteps or maybe distant voices. But it was too faint to be sure. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why would someone be calling me, a complete stranger, asking for help in the middle of the night? "Where are you?" I asked, my voice softer now, more cautious. This time, there was an answer, barely more than a whisper. "I don't know. I'm trapped." A chill ran down my spine. "Trapped where? What do you mean?" I don't know how long I've been here," the voice continued, their words disjointed, like they were struggling to stay focused. "It's dark. I'm scared." I glanced around my dark bedroom, the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. The room felt colder suddenly, and my skin prickled with an uneasy tension. "Tell me where you are," I said again. "I can help you, but you need to tell me where you are." The voice didn't respond right away. There was a long stretch of silence, followed by another crackle of static. "Don't let it find me," they whispered. "Please, don't let it find me." My heart skipped a beat. What? What are you talking about? What's trying to find you?" But before I could get an answer, the line went dead again. This time, I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again, half expecting the voice to come back. But it didn't. I thought about calling the police, telling them about the strange calls. But what could I say? That someone was calling me, asking for help. It wasn't like I had any useful information to give them. No name, no location, nothing but a voice. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was this person? Why were they calling me? And what had they meant by "don't let it find me"? That evening, as the sun began to set, I felt the tension building in my chest again. I hadn't heard from the mysterious caller all day, but something told me it wasn't over. Sure enough, just after midnight, my phone rang. The same number. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. I didn't want to pick up, but something in me needed to know. I answered. "Please," the voice whispered, more urgent this time. "It's getting closer." My heart raced. Who is? What's getting closer? "They're coming," the voice said, their words trembling. "I can't see it, but I can hear it. It's been watching me. I don't have much time." Panic surged through me, but I tried to keep my voice calm. Tell me where you are. I can help you." There was a brief pause, and then, in the softest whisper, they said, "I'm right here." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? Right where?" "I'm with you." The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I instinctively glanced around the room. It was empty, just me, sitting alone in my bedroom. But something about the way they'd said those words made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Where are you?" "You have to stop it," the voice continued, their words becoming more frantic. "It's close. It's almost found me." I stood up, pacing around the room, my mind racing. "I don't understand. What do you want me to do?" "Don't let it in," they whispered, their voice trembling. "Don't let it—" The line went dead again. I stood there in the middle of my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest, the phone still clutched in my hand. The silence was deafening. I stared at the screen, waiting for the call to come back, but it didn't. And then I heard it, a faint sound, coming from somewhere just outside my apartment. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I listened, the sound grew louder, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. I froze, my blood running cold. The tapping was steady, persistent, and it was coming from the front door. I didn't move. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, each tap sending a jolt of fear through my body. I wanted to go to the door, to look through the peephole and see who, or what, was on the other side. But something in me knew that wasn't a good idea. "Don't let it in." The words echoed in my mind over and over again. Whoever had been calling me had warned me. They'd told me not to let it find them, not to let it in. The knocking stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the silence, thick and oppressive, filling the apartment like a suffocating blanket. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the corner of my room, phone in hand, waiting for it to ring again. But it never did. The calls stopped after that night. I never heard from the mysterious voice again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping, like someone, or something, is knocking, waiting to be let in. And every time, I remember the voice's last words. "Don't let it in." You ever get that feeling when you're about to do something and a small voice in your head tells you not to? It's subtle, barely a whisper, but it's there, urging you to reconsider. I felt it the moment we decided to rent the cabin. I can't explain why. It was just a little getaway, something my girlfriend, Jessie, and I had planned for months. But standing there at the edge of the woods, staring up at the place, I couldn't shake the feeling that we should have turned back. We'd found the cabin online, one of those hidden gems people rave about in blog posts. Secluded, peaceful, and perfect for a weekend escape from the grind of city life. The pictures looked amazing, with a cozy fireplace, a wraparound porch, and a view of the mountains that seemed too good to be true. But now, standing in front of it, something about the place felt wrong. "Isn't it perfect?" Jess said, her eyes lighting up as she grabbed our bags from the car. She didn't seem to notice my hesitation. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. "Yeah, perfect," I echoed, though the word felt hollow in my mouth. The cabin was old, much older than it had looked in the photos. The wood was weathered, the windows clouded with dust, and the porch creaked under our weight as we stepped up to the front door. Still, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the forest around us was holding its breath. Jess didn't seem bothered. She unlocked the door, pushing it open with a slight groan from the rusty hinges. "Come on, let's get settled," she called over her shoulder. I followed her inside, my eyes scanning the room. The interior was as rustic as you'd expect: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had seen better days. There was a musty smell, the kind that comes from a place being shut up for too long. But other than that, it seemed normal enough. Still, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. We spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, exploring the area around the cabin, cool and trying to relax. By the time the sun began to set, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. Almost. Jess had started a fire in the fireplace, and we sat on the couch, sipping wine and watching the flames dance, the warmth slowly driving away the chill that had settled into my bones. "You're quiet," Jess said, nudging me with her elbow. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound convincing. "Just tired from the drive." She didn't push it, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I wasn't usually this jumpy, and I knew I wasn't doing a good job hiding it. The night crept in, the darkness swallowing the cabin whole. The forest outside became an impenetrable wall of black, and the silence deepened. We went to bed early, the exhaustion from the day finally catching up with us. That's when things started to get weird. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, maybe the cold or the sound of the wind outside. But then I realized there was something else. A sound. Faint, but distinct. A slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone was walking on the porch. I held my breath, listening, my pulse quickening. The creaking continued, moving back and forth, like someone, or something, was pacing just outside the front door. I glanced over at Jess, who was still sound asleep, oblivious to the noise. For a moment, I debated waking her, but something stopped me. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. Instead, I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The curtains were thin, and through the small gap, I could see the porch bathed in the pale light of the moon. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty porch swaying slightly in the wind. The creaking stopped. I stood there for a long moment, staring out into the night, waiting for the sound to return. But everything was still, the forest silent once more. After what felt like forever, I went back to bed, convincing myself that it was just the wind, just the old wood of the porch settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I didn't mention the noise to Jess. It seemed pointless. She was in a great mood, excited to explore the trails around the cabin, and I didn't want to ruin the weekend with my paranoia. So I shoved the thought to the back of my mind and tried to enjoy the day. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Everywhere we went, I felt eyes on us, watchful, hidden eyes lurking in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone, that something was out there, just beyond the edge of our vision, waiting. Jess didn't seem to notice, laughing and chatting as we hiked through the woods, snapping pictures and pointing out wildlife. But I noticed every sound, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again, and the uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. I wanted to tell Jess, to suggest we leave early, but I knew how ridiculous it would sound. We'd only been there for a day, and there was nothing concrete at least, that should have made me feel this way. Still, that night, the creaking started again. This time, I didn't even try to sleep. As soon as I heard the first groan of the porch boards, I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was the same as before, slow, deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I didn't bother with the window this time. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slipped out of bed, making my way to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, the cold metal sending a chill through me. Every instinct I had was telling me not to open it, not to look outside, but I did it anyway. The door creaked open, and I stepped onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, biting, and the forest was still as death. I shined the light across the porch, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no one there. The porch was empty, but the creaking hadn't stopped. I turned, aiming the light toward the far end of the porch, and that's when I saw it. A faint shadow, barely visible in the beam of the flashlight. It moved slowly, swaying with the creak of the porch boards, but there was nothing to cast it. No figure, no person, just the shadow itself, dark and shapeless, pacing back and forth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stopped, as if it had noticed me, and then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure: we needed to leave. Now. I woke Jess, trying to stay calm as I explained that we had to go. She was groggy, confused, but the panic in my voice must have convinced her. Within minutes, we were packed and in the car, driving away from the cabin as fast as the winding road would allow. As we left, I glanced back one last time. The cabin stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. I'd felt it, seen it. When we got home, I tried to look up the cabin again, out of curiosity, but it was gone. The listing had been taken down, no trace of it anywhere online. Even the blog posts that had raved about it were gone, wiped from the web as if the place had never existed. But I know it was real. And whatever was in that cabin, whatever was pacing on that porch, it's still there, waiting. Have you ever had that gut feeling when you're about to do something and a small voice in your head tells you not to? It's subtle, barely a whisper, but it's there, urging you to reconsider. I felt it the moment we decided to take that road. I can't explain why, it was just a shortcut, something my girlfriend Jess and I had planned for the trip back. But standing there at the edge of that empty road, staring into the darkness ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we should have turned back. I've always loved driving at night. There's something soothing about the quiet hum of the car and the dark stretch of highway ahead. You get lost in the rhythm of it, like you're the only person left in the world. Jess had already fallen asleep beside me, her head resting on her arm against the window. We'd been driving for hours, and I was looking forward to getting home. That's when I saw the sign for the shortcut, a narrow road branching off the main highway. The GPS said it would shave off about 45 minutes from our trip, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. I signaled, turned the wheel, and took the exit. The first few miles were fine, just like any other back road. The trees were tall and thick on either side, making the night feel even darker than it was. But after about 20 minutes, something started to feel off. The road just seemed to stretch on, with no turns, no signs, and not a single car in sight. The GPS had stopped giving directions, frozen on the same screen, as if it didn't know where I was. I glanced over at Jess, still sound asleep, and decided not to wake her. I didn't want to sound paranoid. It was just a road, after all. It couldn't go on forever, right? But it did. I checked the dashboard clock. It had been over an hour since we'd turned onto this road, and still, nothing. The same trees, the same stretch of asphalt, no intersections, no rest stops, nothing. I tried fiddling with the GPS, but it was still frozen. My phone had no signal, and the radio only played static. The unease that had been quietly building started to gnaw at me. I looked out the window, trying to spot something familiar, but it all looked the same. That's when I noticed something else. There were no stars. The sky, which should have been clear and full of stars in the countryside, was a pitch-black void. A shiver ran down my spine. I pressed down on the gas a little harder, hoping that if I just kept driving, we'd hit some sign of life, anything. But the further we went, the more I felt like we were the only ones out here. The trees were too still, and the darkness outside seemed thicker than before. Then, out of nowhere, the road began to feel narrower, like it was closing in on us. The headlights barely pierced the night, casting weak beams ahead as if the dark was swallowing the light. I felt my chest tighten. There was something wrong with this place. That's when Jess stirred. "Are we almost home?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Yeah, soon," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Why does it feel like we've been driving forever?" "I don't know," I admitted. "This road, it doesn't feel right. It just keeps going." Jess looked out the window, her brow furrowing. "Where are we?" "I took a shortcut," I said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my voice. Jess stared at the dark road ahead, and I could tell she felt it too. The strangeness, the isolation. "Maybe we should turn around." I nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right." I slowed the car, preparing to do a U-turn in the middle of the road. But as I started to turn the wheel, the headlights caught something in the distance. A shape, barely visible, standing on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. Jess leaned forward, squinting. "What is that?" I brought the car to a stop, the headlights fully illuminating the figure. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one, standing perfectly still at the edge of the road, facing away from us, their back turned to the car. Should we help them?" Jess asked, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Something in me screamed, "No," but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off them. The figure stood motionless, almost like they were waiting for something. I reached for the gear shift, ready to reverse, when suddenly, the figure stepped forward. Not toward the car, but deeper into the woods. It disappeared into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel and turning us around. I floored it, speeding back the way we'd come, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. The road stretched out behind us, the trees blurring as we sped down the dark asphalt. But then I realized something. The road didn't look the same. It was different. There were no signs, no intersections, and no landmarks. The trees were taller, denser, and the air inside the car felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "I don't remember this," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't the same road." I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the road ahead, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I pressed down on the gas, but no matter how fast I drove, it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, and for a brief second, everything went black. When the lights came back on, I nearly slammed on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road, just ahead, was the same figure we'd seen before, only this time, it was facing us. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, silhouetted in the headlights. But the way they stood there, perfectly still, sent a chill through my entire body. "Go," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Just go." I didn't need to be told twice. I swerved around the figure, not daring to look at it as we passed. My heart raced as we sped down the road, the dark trees closing in around us again. We drove for what felt like hours, but the road never changed. It was like we were trapped in some endless loop, driving the same stretch of highway over and over. And then, just when I thought we'd never get out, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. I pressed down on the gas and speeding toward it, praying it was an end to this nightmare. As we got closer, I realized what it was. A gas station, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. I pulled into the lot, the car skidding to a stop. The air around us felt different, lighter somehow, like we'd finally escaped. Jess and I sat there for a moment, catching our breath, neither of us saying a word. The road behind us was empty, the dark stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. We didn't look back as we drove away, and we never took that road again. Some places are meant to stay hidden, and that road, whatever it was one of them.